She arrived alone in the middle of Montana wilderness. No family, no protection, no one waiting for her anywhere. When dangerous men thought they could break her, they were wrong. Clara Ashford didn't run. She stood her ground. And the toughest man in the valley, a man who had sworn never to let anyone in, was forced to rethink everything he believed about strength, about loneliness, and about what it meant to build a life worth living. This is a story about love forged in fire and dust, about courage born in the last place anyone expected to find it. If this story moves you, hit that like button and drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this has traveled, and follow the channel so you never miss what comes next. The rattlesnake was coiled in the middle of the road when Clara Ashford pulled her wagon to a stop. It wasn't a small one. It was thick through the body, the color of dry dirt, and it had its head raised in that particular way that meant it had already decided this strip of earth belonged to it. The horse, a dun mare named Ruth that Clara had owned for 3 years and trusted completely, stamped one hoof and shifted her weight backward, her ears flat against her skull. Clara didn't move for a moment. She sat on the wagon bench with the reins loose in her hands and looked at the snake, and the snake looked back at her with eyes like 2 chips of black glass. Then she reached under the bench, pulled out the Winchester she kept wrapped in an old flour sack, and shot the snake through the head. The sound cracked out over the Montana grassland and rolled off into nothing. Ruth startled, but didn't bolt. Clara had trained her past bolting. The snake twitched twice and went still. Clara rewrapped the rifle, tucked it back under the bench, clicked her tongue at Ruth, and kept driving. That was how she'd been moving for the better part of 2 weeks. A problem would appear in the road, she'd deal with it, and she'd keep going. She didn't see the sense in treating every obstacle like a catastrophe. The land out here certainly didn't care whether you catastrophized or not. It was going to be the same land either way, brown and gold and enormous and brutally indifferent to your feelings about it. She was following a set of directions written in a man's blocky handwriting on the back of a feed store receipt. The directions had come from a woman named Dora Purcell, who ran a boarding house in Billings, who had taken Clara in for 2 nights when she was passing through and clearly needed a bed, and who had told her over breakfast on the second morning that she had a cousin with a cattle ranch 2 days west who had just lost his cook, and was, in Dora's words, in a terrible state about it, though he'd never admit that to a living soul. He's not easy, Dora had warned her, refilling Clara's coffee without being asked, which was a quality Clara respected enormously in a person. He's stubborn as a fence post and half as warm, but the pay's fair, the hands are decent, and the land is beautiful if you can get past the parts that want to kill you. What parts want to kill you? Clara had asked. Dora had thought about it seriously. The weather, the wildlife, the neighbors, some of them, and Colton himself, if you catch him at the wrong hour. She'd paused. Though I don't mean that literally. He's not violent, he's just difficult. Clara had folded the receipt into her coat pocket and thanked her for breakfast. She'd been called difficult herself, more than once. It didn't strike her as a disqualifying quality. The Mercer Ranch announced itself with a cattle gate and a wooden sign that had weathered to the color of old bones. The name Mercer was carved into it in letters that had been deep once and were now worn shallow by years of wind and freeze and thaw. Clara drove through the gate and up a rutted track that cut through open pasture, the grass on either side moving in long, slow waves. The ranch yard was larger than she'd expected. A main house sat back from the yard, 2 stories, built from rough timber that had darkened with age, a covered porch running the length of the front. Beside it stood a cookhouse separate from the main building, which was sensible given the fire risk. A long bunkhouse ran parallel to the eastern fence. 2 barns, a smokehouse, a root cellar with a slanted door that needed new hinges based on how it sat in its frame, and a corral where 3 horses stood hip-shot in the afternoon sun. 3 men were working near the larger barn. They stopped when they saw the wagon. One of them, young, maybe 20, with a sunburned neck and an expression of open curiosity, leaned on a fence post and watched her come in. Another, older, with a gray mustache and a permanent squint, crossed his arms. The third just looked confused, which might have been his natural state. Clara pulled Ruth to a stop near the hitching post by the main house and set the brake. "Afternoon?" she called. The young one with the sunburn raised his chin. "Afternoon, ma'am. You looking for someone?" "I'm looking for Colton Mercer." The men exchanged a glance. The older one with the mustache unfolded his arms. "What for?" "Heard he needs a cook." Another glance. The young one looked like he was trying not to smile and mostly failing. "Yes, ma'am. He does. He looked toward the main house. "He's in there somewhere. You could knock." "I will," Clara said, and climbed down from the wagon. She was tall for a woman, nearly 5'8", and lean in the way that came from hard work rather than sparse eating because she ate plenty. Her hair was dark brown and pinned up under a hat that had seen better decades. Her coat was good quality once and was now simply functional. She had a face that wasn't beautiful in any way people bothered to paint, but it was a face that made you feel, when she looked at you, that she was actually paying attention, which was its own kind of remarkable. She knocked on the door of the main house. Nothing for a moment. Then footsteps, and the door opened. Colton Mercer was not what she'd pictured from Dora's description, though in retrospect she wasn't sure what she'd pictured. He was 38 or thereabouts, broad through the shoulders, with dark hair that needed cutting and a jaw that needed shaving and eyes that were a very specific shade of gray that Clara had only seen in clouds before a storm. He was wearing a work shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows, and he had the look of a man who'd been interrupted in the middle of something he considered important, which was apparently just standing in his own kitchen doing nothing, based on what she could see over his shoulder. He looked at her. She looked at him. "Mr. Mercer?" she said. "That's right." His voice was lower than she'd expected. Not deep in a theatrical way, just settled, the way a voice gets when it hasn't been forced to charm anyone in a long time. "My name is Clara Ashford. Your cousin Dora told me you need a cook. I'm a cook." He studied her for a moment. Not rude about it, not particularly warm either, just looking, the way you look at something before you decide whether it's worth the trouble. "You come alone?" he said. "I did." "From where?" "Billings, most recently. Before that, various places." "What kind of various places?" "Kansas, Nebraska, a few years in Colorado. I've been moving west." She waited, and when he didn't say anything, she added, "I'm a good cook, Mr. Mercer. I can do the work you need done. I'm not asking you to take my word for it. Let me make supper tonight, and you can judge for yourself." His expression didn't change exactly, but something shifted in it. He looked past her at the wagon, which was loaded with a canvas-covered bundle and a crate strapped to the back, and Ruth standing patiently at the post. Then he looked back at Clara. "We eat at 6, he said. "Kitchen's through there. It's a mess. My last cook left in a hurry." "I can work with a mess," Clara said. He stepped back from the door without quite inviting her in, which she decided to interpret as an invitation. The kitchen was, in fact, a mess. Not filthy exactly, not the kind of mess that came from deliberate neglect or genuine disorder, but the kind that accumulated when nobody with real organizational instincts had been in charge of a space for a while. Pots stacked wrong, flour spilled and dried on the counter, a cast-iron skillet crusted with something that had cooked down to a lacquer, onions that had started to go, a basket of potatoes that were fine, salt and pepper in the wrong places, a calendar on the wall from 2 years ago. Clara stood in the middle of it for a moment, taking inventory. Then she went back to the wagon, untied her crate from the back, hauled it inside, and went to work. She started with the skillet because she needed it, and it needed her. She put water on to heat, scraped what she could, poured the hot water in, and worked the crust loose with a wooden spoon and coarse salt. While that sat, she dealt with the onions, threw the bad ones, saved what could be saved, and sorted through what was in the larder, which turned out to be better stocked than the state of the kitchen suggested. Dried beans, salt pork, cornmeal, a half-wheel of hard cheese, dried herbs in unlabeled jars that she identified by smell. 3 tins of tomatoes, smoked beef hanging in the smokehouse, which she discovered by stepping outside and opening the door and inhaling. She pulled the smoked beef and brought it in. She soaked the dried beans in cold water. She made biscuits from scratch because they took time, and she had time, working the dough until it was right. She found a spice she wasn't expecting, dried chili pepper, good quality, and used it in the bean stew she was building. She cleaned the skillet properly. She reorganized the counter. She moved the flour to a better location and wiped down the surfaces with a cloth she dampened and wrung out. She didn't transform the kitchen in an afternoon into something from a magazine illustration, because nothing works that cleanly in real life. But by the time 5 o'clock came around, the kitchen smelled like food and functioned like a kitchen, which was a significant improvement. The young cowboy with the sunburned neck appeared in the doorway at 5:45. He'd cleaned himself up some, hat off, hair damp at the edges, a cleaner shirt. "Ma'am," he said. He was sniffing the air with an expression that was almost embarrassingly transparent. "That's... something smells real good. Bean stew with smoked beef, biscuits. Should be ready in about 15 minutes. We haven't had biscuits since..." He stopped. "Anyway, I'm Danny. Danny Holt." He extended a hand, remembered it might not be appropriate, pulled it back, then extended it again. Clara shook it. "Clara Ashford. You really answer the door and ask a man for a job just like that?" "That's how it works," she said. Danny nodded like this made complete sense. "Mr. Mercer said to tell you the hands eat in the bunkhouse, but he eats in the main house. You can eat wherever you want." "I'll eat in the cookhouse," Clara said, "after everyone else is served." Danny looked at her for a moment, then nodded again and disappeared. But there were 7 ranch hands, plus Colton. The hands ranged from Danny, who was the youngest at 19, to a man named Abe, who was somewhere in his mid-50s and had been on the ranch longer than anyone else and had the deeply settled quality of a piece of furniture that had found the right room. The others filled in the middle. Marcus, quiet and precise. Twins named Pete and Will, who finished each other's sentences in a way that was either charming or maddening depending on the day. A Mexican cowboy named Santos, whose English was careful and whose instincts about horses were, she'd learn later, genuinely extraordinary. And a man everyone called Cutter, who had a scar across his left cheek and apparently never explained it, and whom nobody asked. Clara served the hands first, carrying the pot and the basket of biscuits across the yard to the bunkhouse, ladling out portions. She watched them eat. She always watched people eat the first time, because the way a person reacted to food told you something about them that conversation often didn't. Danny ate like he'd been starving, which he probably had been emotionally, if not literally. Marcus tasted carefully before committing, then ate with methodical satisfaction. The twins argued about whether the biscuits were better than their mother's until Will admitted that they were actually better than their mother's, and Pete hit him in the shoulder. Santos said, "Muy buena," and meant it. Abe didn't say anything, but he used a biscuit to wipe his bowl clean when he was done, which was the highest compliment. Cutter looked at his food for a moment, then ate it all without speaking, which was its own kind of verdict. Clara carried the rest of the stew and the remaining biscuits to the main house. She knocked on the back door, the kitchen entrance, and Colton opened it. He'd washed up, she noticed, changed his shirt. She didn't remark on it. She set the pot on the stove to keep warm and put 2 biscuits on a plate. "I'll leave it here," she said. "You can serve yourself." He looked at the pot, then at her. "You're not eating." "After you're settled, I eat in the cookhouse." "Why?" She looked at him. "Because it makes sense to keep things orderly from the start." He didn't argue with that. He pulled a chair out and sat at the kitchen table, which she took as her cue to ladle out a portion and set it in front of him. She started to turn away, but he said, "You can sit." She turned back. "At the table," he added, which shouldn't have needed clarifying, but apparently did. She sat across from him. She didn't have her own bowl, so she folded her hands on the table and waited while he tried the stew. He took a spoonful, chewed, looked at the bowl. He took another spoonful. "It's good," he said. "Thank you." "The chili was in the back of the larder. I didn't think it was still good." "It was still good." He nodded. He broke a biscuit open. Steam rose from the inside. He looked at it like it had done something surprising. "Where'd you learn to cook?" "My mother. Restaurants, some, when I was younger. Ranch kitchens, mostly, for the last several years." "What ranches?" She named 3. He knew one of them by reputation, a large outfit in Colorado that had changed hands twice and had a decent name for cattle quality. "Why'd you leave Colorado?" "The ranch sold. New owners brought their own people." "And before that?" She looked at him steadily. "I move around. That's not a crime." "I didn't say it was." He broke the other half of the biscuit and ate it. "I just need to know if someone's going to hire on and leave in a month." "I don't leave jobs in a month unless the job gives me a reason to." What constitutes a reason? She thought about it honestly. Being cheated on wages, being treated disrespectfully, unsafe conditions that the employer refuses to address. She paused. Violence. His expression didn't change. None of those things happen on this ranch. Then I won't leave in a month. He was quiet for a while. He finished the stew and pushed the bowl back slightly, not away, just back, the way people do when they're done eating but not done sitting. The previous cook, he said. She left because her mother took sick, back east. She didn't have any choice in it. I'm sorry to hear that. She'd been here 6 years. He said it without sentimentality, just as a fact, but Clara understood that a fact could carry weight without being decorated with feelings. 6 years was a long time. Things got settled in 6 years. You'll want references, she said. I have 2 letters. They're in the wagon. Get them tomorrow. He stood, carried his bowl to the basin, and rinsed it. It was such a domestic, unconscious gesture, rinsing his own bowl without thinking about it, that Clara found it unexpectedly humanizing. The job pays $12 a month, room in the cookhouse, meals included, obviously. You'd be cooking for 8, sometimes more when we bring in extra hands for roundup. That's fair. I need someone who can manage the larder, keep inventory, know when to order, deal with the supply wagon that comes through every 3 weeks. The last cook kept the books for the kitchen supplies. Can you do that? Yes. Can you read and write clearly? Better than clearly. He looked at her. There was something in his eyes that wasn't quite suspicion, but wasn't quite trust either. Something in between, a kind of watchful neutrality that she suspected was just how he operated by default. All right, Miss Ashford, he said. We'll see how the week goes. Clara, she said. Clara, then. He moved toward the door to the main part of the house and paused with his hand on the frame. The hands wake at 5. Breakfast at 5:30. I usually eat later, 7 or so. I'll have it ready. He nodded once and disappeared through the door. Clara sat at the table for a moment by herself. The kitchen was quieter now. Outside, she could hear the ranch sounds settling into evening. Horses in the corral, the distant creak of the bunkhouse door, someone laughing at something, then quiet. She got up and washed the pot. The cookhouse had a cot, a small table, a window that looked east toward the hills, and a hook on the wall for her coat. There was a braided rug on the floor that was old but clean and a lantern that worked. Clara made up the cot with her own blankets, hung her coat, set her trunk under the table, and sat on the edge of the cot for a moment. She'd been doing this for 8 years, moving into small rooms in unfamiliar places and making them temporarily hers. She'd gotten good at the practicalities of it. The emotional part she'd stopped examining too closely, not because it didn't exist, but because examining it hadn't ever improved it. She was 31 years old. She'd been on her own since she was 22, when the last person who'd constituted family, her uncle, who was not a warm man but was at least a present one, had died of a stroke in his dry goods store in Lawrence, Kansas. She had a cousin somewhere in Missouri whom she'd met twice. She'd had friends, several good ones, but friends in a traveling life were people you stayed in contact with through letters and then, eventually, didn't. She didn't dwell on this. Dwelling wasn't useful. What was useful was the fact that she had a job, a dry place to sleep, and enough food to eat well. What was useful was that the kitchen she'd work in was salvageable. The men she'd be cooking for seemed decent, and the employer, while not warm, had rinsed his own bowl and paid a fair wage and hadn't looked at her the way some men looked at women who showed up alone and asked for work. She blew out the lantern and lay down in the dark. Outside, the Montana sky was doing what it always did, being enormous and incomprehensible and full of stars in a way that made Clara feel not small exactly, but accurately sized, like the universe had told her the truth about her dimensions, and somehow that was a comfort. She was asleep in 10 minutes. Possible. She'd been on the Mercer Ranch for 3 days when she understood what the situation really was. The work itself wasn't difficult, not in the sense of being beyond her, though it was relentless in the way ranch cooking always was. Breakfast at 5:30 for 7 hungry men meant being up at 4:45, fire going, biscuits or cornbread in, bacon or salt pork rendering, eggs cracked and waiting. Coffee always. Always coffee, and plenty of it, because a cowboy without morning coffee was just a man with a bad attitude and a horse. Lunch was packed if they were riding out, served in the cookhouse if they were working close. Supper was the main event, the meal that had to satisfy, that had to carry some variety across the week so nobody started dreading the table. She rotated what she could. Bean stew, then beef stew, then salt pork with greens when she could get them, then a soup she made from the bone of the smoked beef with whatever vegetables survived. She made cornbread more than biscuits because it was faster, and the men seemed to like it equally. She made a rice pudding on the fourth night that caused Danny Holt to say, with complete sincerity, that he believed she might be the greatest human being he'd ever met, which she took as a professional compliment. But underneath the rhythm of the work, she was watching. She'd always been a watcher. It was how she'd learned to read rooms quickly, to know which foreman was fair and which was trouble, to understand what a new place actually was versus what it presented itself as being. What the Mercer Ranch actually was, she determined over those first 3 days, was a place under significant strain. The cattle numbers were good. She'd gathered that much from overheard conversations. Santos had told her while she was filling his lunch pail that the herd was in decent condition going into the season. But there was something else, a tension that moved through the hands' conversations and broke off when they noticed her listening. Colton ate his breakfast alone at 7 every morning, and then disappeared into his office in the main house for an hour before going out to work alongside the hands, which wasn't what a man without worries did. On the evening of the third day, she was cleaning up after supper when she heard raised voices from somewhere outside, not at the bunkhouse, from the direction of the road. She wiped her hands and went to the cookhouse door. A wagon was stopped outside the ranch gate. 2 men sat in it, neither of them familiar to her. One of them, large, with a red beard, was saying something that she couldn't quite catch, his voice carrying the particular edge of a man who was used to being loud enough that people backed down before he finished. Colton was standing at the gate. Abe was beside him. Both of them had the very still quality of men who had made a decision to be still and were working at it. "Told you Hendricks wants an answer before the month's out," the red-bearded man was saying. "You keep stalling, you're going to find yourself with fewer options." "I gave Hendricks my answer," Colton said. His voice was level. "It hasn't changed. He's offering a fair price." "He's offering a price," Colton said. "There's a difference." The man shifted in the wagon seat. His companion, younger, with a mean set to his shoulders, was watching Abe with a specific kind of attention that Clara recognized as the kind men directed at people they were calculating could be removed as a variable. "You're being foolish," the red-bearded man said. "The valley's changing. The small outfits can't survive what's coming." "Whose valley?" Colton said. A pause. The man's expression hardened. "Think carefully, Mercer." "I have," Colton said. "Good evening." He stood there until they drove away. Then he and Abe exchanged a look that contained about 8 full sentences of communication and went back toward the main house without speaking aloud. Clara stepped back inside the cookhouse. She'd seen this before. The particular shape of a powerful neighbor who wanted something and was used to getting it. She'd seen it in Kansas. She'd seen it in Colorado. She'd seen it in enough places that she knew the pattern. The men in the wagon weren't the problem themselves. They were an announcement of a problem, which was always worse, because it meant the problem had already organized itself and was approaching on a schedule. She thought about this while she finished the dishes. Then she set it aside because it wasn't her problem yet, and might never be. She made a list for the supply order. She was running low on dried beans, nearly out of the good chili pepper, and needed more cornmeal. She'd found a crock of lard in the cellar that was still good. She wrote it all down in the kitchen ledger in her clean, practical handwriting and set the pencil down. Whatever was coming for this ranch was coming whether she wrote it in a ledger or not. By the end of the first week, she had the kitchen running the way she needed it to run, which meant it ran on a schedule that the men could rely on, and that didn't require her to be present every single minute. She had the inventory organized and the larder cataloged. She'd identified which supplies were adequate, which were low, and which needed to be sourced locally when the supply wagon wasn't due for 2 weeks. She'd also learned the men. Danny was the easiest, open, good-natured, with a laugh that came quickly and a willingness to help that was genuine rather than performative. He'd started appearing in the kitchen doorway at random intervals, not asking for anything, just talking, which Clara found she didn't mind. He was from Idaho originally, had come to Montana for work 2 years ago, and was the kind of young that still believed the future would largely arrange itself favorably, which she hoped lasted him a few more years before the world corrected it. Marcus was quiet but reliable. He never complained about food, never asked for anything specific, and always returned his dishes to the kitchen rather than leaving them for her to collect from the bunkhouse, which she appreciated more than she said. The twins were chaos, but functional chaos. They bickered constantly, but neither of them meant any of it. They were 24, from Wyoming, and had been inseparable since birth in the way that made you wonder how they'd each eventually learn to be alone. Santos was, she decided by the end of the first week, the most capable person on the ranch after Colton himself. He moved through his work with an economy of motion that was almost meditative. He spoke carefully in English and with rapid fluency in Spanish, and he'd established early on that Clara's cooking reminded him of his mother's, which was the highest compliment available in his personal lexicon. Abe was the ranch's memory. He knew where everything was, what everything had cost when it was bought, how a piece of equipment had broken the last 3 times, and why a certain pasture gate needed to be approached from the left side. He dispensed this information without being asked to whoever needed it, and Clara realized quickly that Abe was essentially the connective tissue of the whole operation, the thing that held the knowledge and made the knowledge useful. Cutter remained a mystery. He did his work without complaint, ate without comment, and returned his dishes like Marcus. The scar on his cheek was old and well-healed, and whatever story it carried, it wasn't one he offered. Clara didn't ask. She'd worked with men who had passed that wanted quiet, and quiet was something she was capable of providing. Colton, she was still working out. He was at the ranch every day. She could see that, from the cookhouse window or from the door when she was coming and going. He wasn't a man who managed from a distance. He worked alongside the hands, fixing fence, moving cattle, doing the unglamorous maintenance labor that kept a ranch functional. She'd seen him come in from a day's work with his hands scraped and his shirt dark with sweat and mud on his boots, and he'd clean up and eat his supper in the kitchen and say very little, and what he said was usually functional rather than social. He wasn't cold. That was the thing she kept revising her understanding of. He'd been cold that first evening, or something she'd read as cold, but on closer observation it wasn't coldness exactly. It was more like he'd gotten into the habit of running his life on minimum fuel. Minimum words, minimum expressions, minimum reaching out toward people, because reaching had cost him things in the past, and he'd found that conservation was easier. She didn't know what it had cost him. She didn't ask, but she saw it in him the way you saw the mark of an old break in a bone that had healed slightly wrong. The structure was sound, the function was fine, but the angle wasn't quite what it would have been before. On Friday evening of the first week, she made a venison roast. Abe had brought in a deer the day before, a clean shot, good animal, and Clara had spent part of the morning butchering it properly and setting the best cut to marinate. She made roasted potatoes and a gravy and the last of the week's biscuits and served it at 6. The bunkhouse went quiet when the food appeared, which was its own kind of applause. She brought a plate to the main house at 7, knocked, and Colton answered the door with his sleeves rolled up and a pen in his hand, which meant she'd interrupted the accounts. "Venison," she said, and handed him the plate. He looked at it. Then he looked up at her. Something crossed his face that wasn't quite an expression, but was adjacent to one. Something surprised and unguarded that came and went fast. "Thank you," he said. "There's gravy in a jar on the stove," she said. "Pour it while it's hot." She turned and went back to the cookhouse without waiting for a response, because she'd learned already that if you waited for Colton Mercer to say something warmer than "thank you," you'd be standing on the porch for a long time. But when she was halfway across the yard, she heard him behind her. "Clara." She turned. He was still standing in the doorway, plate in one hand, pen still absurdly in the other. The lamplight behind him turned the edges of everything gold. "The references," he said. "I looked at them. The men you worked for spoke well of you." "Good," she said. A pause. "You can stay," he said, which she was fairly certain was not what he'd meant to say exactly, or maybe not the way he'd meant to say it, because something shifted in his expression immediately after, a slight tightening, like he'd heard his own words land differently than intended. "I know," Clara said. "We settled that last week." And she went inside before either of them could make it more complicated than it was. The second week brought rain. Montana rain in early spring was not the gentle variety. It came in sideways, carried on wind that had nothing soft about it, And it didn't care what it got wet or how long it stayed. The ranch yard turned to mud. The hands came in for meals looking like they'd been partially submerged and dried badly. Clara made hot food and plenty of it, because there was a specific misery to cold wet work that could only be adequately answered by warmth in the belly. She made a beef soup that she kept on the stove all day so the men could come in and help themselves between tasks. She made coffee every 2 hours. She baked the entire morning of the second rainy day, producing a quantity of cornbread that she stacked in a cloth-covered pile on the bunkhouse table, and was rewarded by Pete saying, "I think I love you, Miss Clara," in a tone of complete sincerity, which Will confirmed by nodding emphatically. She was not immune to being appreciated. She'd been on ranches where the cook was treated as furniture, necessary and expected and utterly unremarked upon, and she knew the difference between that and this. The Mercer hands were decent people. They noticed things. They said thank you. Danny helped her carry a heavy sack of flour from the root cellar when he caught her wrestling it up the stairs. Not because she'd asked, but because he'd seen it needed doing. She started to like them. She tried not to do this too quickly, but it happened anyway, which was a thing about her that she'd stopped being able to prevent. On the third day of rain, the supply wagon came through early. The driver didn't want to get caught on the high road if the weather worsened, and Clara dealt with it while Colton was out in the south pasture dealing with a downed fence. She checked the delivery against her list, found 2 shortages and 1 substitution, negotiated with the driver with enough firmness that he produced the missing items from the back of the wagon where they'd been moved by mistake, and signed the invoice. When Colton came in at noon, mud to the knee, she showed him the invoice. He looked at it, looked at the initialed correction she'd made. You docked him for the substitution. He sent pickling salt instead of curing salt. They're not the same thing. I reduced the line item accordingly. Colton looked at her for a moment. He didn't argue, he said. He started to. I explained the difference between pickling salt and curing salt in enough detail that he decided his time was better spent finding the correct item. Something happened at the corner of Colton's mouth. It wasn't quite a smile. It was too small and too controlled to be called a smile without being generous with the word. But it was something. An acknowledgement. An involuntary flicker of something that might have been the precursor to amusement. Good, he said, and poured himself coffee. She'd been watching for those moments, she realized. The ones where the controlled face opened slightly and something real appeared behind it, and then closed again. She didn't know why she was watching for them. She told herself it was just the natural habit of attention, the same thing she'd always done with new employers, reading them to understand what she was working with. She didn't look too hard at whether that was the full truth. But the trouble started on a Wednesday in the 3rd week. She was coming back from the root cellar with a basket of potatoes when she heard riders coming up the road fast, which was not how people arrived at a ranch with good intentions. She set the basket down and stood at the cookhouse door. 3 riders. Not the men from the wagon the first week. Different men, younger, with the careless confidence of people who'd never personally faced consequences for their carelessness. They pulled up in the yard hard enough that mud sprayed, which was both reckless and a specific kind of showing off. The ranch was quiet. Most of the hands were out in the east pasture, a long ride from here. Colton was in the barn. Abe was somewhere. She wasn't sure. One of the riders, a broad-shouldered young man with a jaw like a shovel and a hat he clearly thought made him look significant, swung down from his horse and looked around the yard with the proprietary air of someone who was either inspecting his own property or wanted to be. "Hey," he called. "Anybody here?" Clara picked up her basket. The rider's eyes landed on her. He smiled in a way that had nothing pleasant in it. "Well, who are you?" "I work here," she said. "And you're in the yard without an invitation, which is a good way to get yourself shot." The rider laughed. His companions laughed. It was the laugh of men who thought a woman saying anything with authority was inherently funny. "Settle down, sweetheart," he said, and started walking toward her. This was the moment most people made the mistake of retreating. Clara set the potato basket down on the ground, reached through the cookhouse door for the Winchester she kept just inside it, and held it loosely at her side in a way that was not pointing at him, but not pointing at him either. He stopped. "I said you're in the yard without an invitation," she said. "That's a statement of fact, not a greeting. Now tell me who you are and what you want." Or you can ride back out the gate and tell whoever sent you that Mercer Ranch doesn't receive uninvited company." The man's smile had gone somewhere. His jaw tightened. Behind him, his companions had stopped laughing and developed more cautious expressions. "We're just," he started. "Don't want to hear just," Clara said. "Want to hear who you are and what you want." "Lyle Decker," a voice said from behind her. She didn't startle. She'd heard Colton coming from the barn, his footsteps recognizable to her now after 3 weeks. He stepped up beside her in the yard, not in front of her, just beside her, which she noted and appreciated. The shovel-jawed man, Lyle Decker, apparently, looked from Clara to Colton with an expression that had reorganized itself into something between belligerence and reassessment. "Mercer," Decker said. "What do you want, Decker?" Colton said. "Hendricks wants to meet. Says you haven't responded to his last message." "I've responded to all of Hendricks' messages. He doesn't like the responses." Decker's eyes slid back to Clara briefly, then away. "Thought it was worth a personal visit." "You've made it," Colton said. "You can tell Hendricks the same thing I told the last men he sent. The answer's no. It's been no. It'll keep being no." Decker's jaw worked. His companions shifted in their saddles. "He's not going to like that," Decker said. "I'm not working to make Hendricks like things," Colton said. A silence in which several things were communicated without words. Decker looked at Colton. Colton looked at Decker. Clara stood with the Winchester at her side and looked at all three of them, which was a slightly different kind of looking. The kind that said she had cataloged each person present and calculated the relevant distances. Decker got back on his horse. He looked down at Colton from there with the look of a man who believed elevation was an argument. "You're making a mistake," he said. "Probably," Colton said. "Goodbye, Lyle." Decker rode out. His companions followed. The yard was quiet. Clara leaned the Winchester against the doorframe and picked up her potato basket. Colton looked at her. "Where did you get that?" he said, meaning the rifle. "Brought it with me," she said. "I keep it inside the door." He was quiet for a moment. That was Lyle Decker. He works for a man named Cal Hendricks, who owns the Hendricks Consolidated Operation on the other side of the ridge. He's been trying to buy out every small ranch in the valley for the past 2 years. "I gathered that," Clara said, "from the men who came the first week." He looked at her. "You heard that?" "I was at the cookhouse door. I wasn't eavesdropping." "No, I know." He paused. "What did you think?" It was an unusual question, not the kind she expected from him. She considered it honestly. "I think a man who sends 3 young men to intimidate a rancher is running out of patience," she said, which usually means he's running out of time. Something's changed in his situation that's making him push harder than he was. Colton was quiet for a moment. He looked at the road where the riders had gone. "His operation is leveraged," he said. "He borrowed heavily to buy out the Harmon property last fall. If he can't consolidate enough land to run the size of herd, he promised his investors he's in trouble. Then he's going to get more aggressive." "Yes." Clara looked at him. "What are you going to do?" "Keep saying no," he said. "That's not a plan." "It's the beginning of one." She picked up the basket. "You should bring the hands back closer to the ranch for the next few weeks. Don't leave it understaffed." He looked at her for a moment with the expression that wasn't quite an expression, the one she'd come to understand as him doing rapid reassessment. "You're probably right," he said. "I know," she said, and went inside to make supper. She made pepper-crusted beef that night with roasted onions, and she added dried apple to the dessert she'd been planning because she felt the men deserved something extra after a day that had contained Lyle Decker, and because she'd found the apples in the back of the larder and they needed to be used. After supper, after the kitchen was clean and the bunkhouse was quiet, she sat at the small table in the cookhouse with the lantern on and wrote a letter. She was not, generally speaking, a person who wrote letters for emotional reasons. Letters were for information, practicalities, arrangements, the occasional news. But tonight she found herself writing to a woman named Judith Cole, who had been the cook on a ranch in Colorado where Clara had worked 3 years before, and who had been the closest thing to a friend that Clara had had in a long time. She wrote about Montana, which was large and cold and beautiful in a way that felt almost aggressive about it. She wrote about the ranch, which was well run in the basic ways and chaotic in some of the others. She wrote about the hands because they were worth writing about. She did not write about Colton Mercer. She thought about him, though, while she wrote about other things. Thought about the way he'd stepped up beside her and not in front of her in the yard. Thought about the fact that he hadn't told her to put the rifle down or stepped in to handle it himself, that he'd let her hold her ground and had added himself to the situation rather than replacing her in it. She thought about the way the lamplight had fallen across the doorway that first Friday evening, and the expression he'd had with the plate in his hand that had come and gone like weather. She folded the letter without finishing it. She'd finish it another night. She blew out the lantern and listened to the Montana dark, the wind picking up from the west, a horse shifting in the corral, the distant call of something she'd never quite identified since she'd arrived. An owl, maybe, or something that wasn't quite an owl. The land out here had sounds that didn't always have names. She lay down and looked at the ceiling she couldn't see in the dark. 8 years of moving, and here she was in a cookhouse in Montana with a Winchester by the door and a potato basket and a man who rinsed his own bowl and stood beside people instead of in front of them, and she was not going to do something stupid like read too much into any of that. She was a practical woman. She closed her eyes. Outside, the wind moved through the grass, and the enormous Montana sky was full of stars that had been there before anyone and would be there after everyone, and didn't much care what Clara Ashford decided to do about any of it. She was asleep by 9 o'clock, which was practical, and if she dreamed, she kept that to herself. 3 days after Lyle Decker and his companions rode out of the ranch yard, the mood on the Mercer Ranch settled back into its working rhythm, but not completely. There was a residue to it, the kind that came from an unfinished thing. Clara could feel it in the way the hands talked at meals, a little quieter than usual, a little more aware of sounds from the road. Santos had started leaving his horse saddled an extra hour in the evenings before putting him up for the night. Abe walked the fence line closest to the road every morning now, which he hadn't done before. Nobody said anything directly. Ranchmen didn't, in her experience. They processed threat the way they processed weather, by adjusting their behavior without discussing the adjustment. Colton had taken her advice about keeping the hands closer. The far pasture work got redistributed, the riding rotations changed, and there were always at least 3 men visible in or around the yard during daylight hours. He hadn't mentioned to her that he'd done it, and she hadn't brought it up. It was simply done, which she found to be the cleanest kind of acknowledgement available. What changed more noticeably was the way the hands related to her. It had been building since the first week. The decent food, the reliability, the fact that she'd learned all their names and their preferences, and the particular things that made each of them human rather than just labor. But the afternoon with Decker had shifted something. She'd stood in the yard with a Winchester and her potato basket, and she hadn't retreated, and they'd all either seen it or heard about it within the hour, because news moved fast in a bunkhouse. And now there was a different quality to how they looked at her. Not worship. She didn't want worship, and it wouldn't have suited any of them anyway. It was more like recalibration. She'd been the cook, competent and appreciated. Now she was also the cook who'd stood her ground, which added a dimension. Danny was the most transparent about it because Danny was transparent about everything. "You weren't scared at all?" he said, appearing in the kitchen doorway on a Thursday morning while she was making breakfast. He did this frequently now. Appeared while she was cooking and asked questions or talked or simply existed in the space in a way that she'd decided was more like a younger sibling than anything else. "I was a little scared," she said, turning bacon in the pan without looking up. "Didn't look it. That's the point." She flipped the last strip. "Being scared is information. Showing it to people who mean you harm is a choice, and it's a bad one." Danny thought about this with the focused expression of someone actually absorbing something rather than just waiting for the next thing to say. He did that sometimes, and she liked him for it. "Where'd you learn to handle a rifle like that?" he said. "My uncle. He wasn't particularly warm, but he was practical. He thought every person should know how to handle a firearm, which is probably the most useful thing he ever passed on." "You ever shot at a person?" "No," she said, hoping to keep that streak going. She put the bacon on a plate and covered it and started on the eggs. Danny helped himself to coffee from the pot without asking, which she'd told him he could do in the second week and which he'd apparently filed away permanently. "What do you think Hendricks is going to do?" he said. "I think that's Mr. Mercer's problem to work out. Not mine," she said. "Hand me that cloth." He handed her the cloth. She didn't say anything else about Hendrix, and after a while Danny drifted back outside, because the conversation had arrived at its natural end. But she was thinking about it. She was always thinking about things she'd decided were not her problem, which was an inefficiency she'd never quite resolved in herself. The first real confrontation happened on a Saturday. Clara had driven the wagon into Delwood, the nearest town, 12 miles east, for supplies that the regular wagon didn't carry. Specialty items, good vinegar, a bolt of cheesecloth for straining, 2 pounds of dried red chili that she couldn't get on the regular order. She'd also needed to visit the post office, because her letter to Judith Cole had finally been finished and she wanted it sent. Delwood was not a large town. It had a main street, a general store, a post office that shared a building with the land registry office, a saloon, a livery, a church that appeared to hold services sporadically, and a diner that served decent pie and bad coffee. It also had, on this particular Saturday, more people in it than usual. There was some kind of livestock auction happening at the far end of town, which explained the extra horses and the elevated noise level. Clara tied Ruth at the post office hitching rail, sent her letter, and crossed to the general store for her supplies. She was comparing 2 grades of vinegar when she became aware of a conversation happening near the front of the store. Not a quiet conversation. "Ought to be a law about it," a woman's voice was saying, with the particular carrying quality of someone who wanted to be heard rather than just speaking. Clara kept comparing vinegar. Coming out to a man's ranch all by herself. No family, no husband. It's not right. Clara set down one of the vinegar bottles and picked up the other. "Mercer ought to know better," a second voice said, lower but equally audible. "Hiring a woman like that, living right there on the property." "Well, what do you expect from him? He's been strange since—" Clara walked to the front of the store with her vinegar and her cheesecloth and set them on the counter. The 2 women who'd been talking were standing near the door. One about 50, in a good dress that had been pressed with care. The other younger, maybe 35, with an expression that was working very hard at being above things. They looked at Clara. Clara looked at them. "Good morning," she said pleasantly. Neither of them said anything. The older one rearranged her expression into something between dignity and discomfort. The younger one looked at the floor. The store owner, a man named Greer who had sold her the previous supplies without incident, appeared from the back and began tallying her purchases with the slightly over-attentive manner of a man who had definitely heard the conversation and was hoping to exit it without damage. "Anything else, Miss Ashford?" Clara said. 2 pounds of the dried red chili, please, if you have it." He had it. He weighed it and added it to the pile. Clara paid with the ranch account, which Colton had added her name to at the start of the second week, and gathered her purchases. She turned toward the door. The 2 women were still there, which meant she had to pass them. She did so, and at the last moment the older one said, loudly enough that there was no pretense it wasn't directed at her, "Shameless." Clara stopped. She stood for a moment with her basket of purchases. Then she turned and looked at the woman directly. "I cook for 8 ranch hands, and I earn my wages same as any of them," she said. "If that's what you mean, I'm not sure what the shame is. If you mean something else, I'd rather you say it plainly than behind someone's back in a store they're standing in." The woman's chin came up. "A woman living alone on a ranch full of men is not respectable." "That's an opinion," Clara said. "It's not a fact, though it's dressed up like one." She held the woman's eyes for a moment, not aggressively, not in the way of wanting a fight, but in the simple, steady way of not being moved. "Have a good morning." She walked out. Her hands were steady on the basket. Her pulse was less steady, but nobody could see her pulse, so it was irrelevant. She drove the wagon back to the ranch without stopping, which meant she skipped the diner and didn't get coffee, which was the actual cost of the morning. She didn't tell anyone about the exchange in the general store. It wasn't the kind of thing that needed to be shared. It hadn't been dangerous, just unpleasant, and unpleasant things that weren't dangerous didn't require reporting. She'd dealt with versions of it before. A woman alone was always a subject, always available for commentary from people who'd appointed themselves the editors of other people's choices. She'd found the most effective response was usually exactly what she'd done: say the true thing without anger and keep moving. What she hadn't anticipated was that Colton would hear about it anyway. She found out he'd heard about it when he appeared at the cookhouse door on Sunday evening while she was cleaning up after supper, with the particular expression of a man who was carrying a piece of information he wasn't sure what to do with. "Greer told me you had words with Margaret Calloway at the store," he said. Clara dried a pot. "I'd call it more of a single exchange than words. Margaret Calloway is married to Edwin Calloway, who owns the Calloway Grain Supply." He paused. "She talks to everyone." "I know the type," Clara said. He came inside and stood near the door, not quite committed to the space. "What did she say?" Clara looked at him. "The usual thing women say about women who work in unconventional arrangements, that it's not respectable." His jaw tightened. "I'll speak to Greer." "Don't," Clara said. Greer didn't say anything. He was polite. She hung up the cloth. "And talking to him won't change what Margaret Calloway thinks. It'll just alert her that it matters, which will make her think it matters more." He stood there for a moment. She could see him working something through, though his face did its usual thing of keeping the work interior. "Does it bother you?" he said. She considered the question honestly because he'd asked it directly enough that he deserved a direct answer. "A little," she said, "not because she's right, because it's tiring. To have people decide who you are from a distance and then talk about it loudly enough that you can hear them." He looked at the table, at the wall, at somewhere that wasn't her. "There are people in town who'll talk about you being here," he said, "being on the ranch. I should have told you that before. Would it have changed anything?" A pause. "I don't know, would it?" She looked at him. "No," she said. "I've never chosen a job based on what Margaret Calloway would say about it." Something happened in his face again. That brief flicker, the involuntary thing. He nodded once and moved toward the door, and then he stopped and said, without quite turning back, "For what it's worth, you're not, what she said, shameless." He said the word like it tasted bad in his mouth. "You're the best worker this ranch has had in a long time. That's what people ought to say, and if they said it, it'd be true." Clara stood still for a moment. "Thank you," she said. He nodded again and went out. She stood at the table after he'd gone and breathed in and breathed out and felt something she wasn't going to name because naming it would require examining it, and she was not ready to do that on a Sunday evening in a ranch cookhouse in Montana. She finished the dishes. The trouble that came next was less civilized than Margaret Calloway. It was a Tuesday, late afternoon, the sky the specific shade of heavy pale blue that happened before weather. Clara was in the yard hanging dish towels on the line, a mundane task, the kind she didn't think about while she was doing it, when three men came through the gate on foot, not on horseback. On foot, which was unusual, and the fact of it being unusual registered before she'd consciously processed why. They were not Lyle Decker's men. Different faces, though the type was familiar. Young, with that same careless confidence, but these ones had it turned up higher, more edge to it. They'd walked from somewhere, which meant their horses were left somewhere, which meant they hadn't wanted to announce themselves with the sound of hooves. Clara finished pinning the last dish towel. "Looking for someone?" she said, without turning around first, because she'd heard their footsteps on the packed dirt, and she knew where they were. The one in front, he had a cut across his knuckles that was still healing, and the kind of smile that was just mouth and no eyes, said, "You the cook?" "That's right." "Mercer around?" "He's on the property," she said, which was true, though she didn't know exactly where. She'd seen him ride east with Santos that morning and hadn't seen him come back yet. "We'll wait," the man said, and took a step toward the cookhouse. "You can wait in the yard," Clara said. He stopped, looked at her with the cut-knuckles smile. "Not real friendly. I don't know you. Friendly's for people I know." She moved slightly, putting herself between him and the cookhouse door with a naturalness that wasn't quite casual, but wasn't quite confrontational, just present. "I'll send someone to find Mr. Mercer. What name should I give him?" "Tell him Harv says hello." She turned toward this bunkhouse and saw, with relief she didn't show, that Marcus was walking across the yard with a coil of rope over his shoulder. She caught his eye and moved her head slightly. Barely, just enough. Marcus looked at the three men. His face didn't change. He changed direction and went toward the barn, which was where Santos would be at this hour. The three men watched this happen. "You signaling someone?" Harv said. I'm having a man let Mr. Mercer know he has visitors, Clara said, which is the appropriate thing to do. She looked at him levelly. Would you like coffee while you wait? He looked at her for a moment, calculating something. Then the smile came back, the hollow variety. Sure. She brought 3 tin cups of coffee from the cookhouse and set them on the yard fence rail. She didn't stand there while they drank it. She went back inside and stood near the door where she could see through the window, and she picked up the Winchester that was leaning inside the door, and she held it in a way that was not pointing at anything, but was also not being hidden. Colton and Santos came across the yard from the barn at a walk, which was the right pace, not rushing, not dawdling. Abe materialized from somewhere, which was what Abe did. Cutter appeared on the bunkhouse porch with his arms crossed and his scar catching the late light. Clara stayed inside. She watched through the window. Colton spoke to the men for about 4 minutes. She couldn't hear the words, but she could read the shape of the conversation. The men said something. Colton responded. The man called Harv said something that made Colton's shoulders go very slightly more square. Colton said something back. And then Harv and his companions picked up the tin cups and set them on the fence rail and left through the gate. Colton stood watching them go. Then he came to the cookhouse door. Who told you to signal Marcus? He said. No one. It seemed like the right thing to do. He looked at her for a moment. They were from Hendricks. Harv Siddons is... He's the one Hendricks uses when he wants to make a point without making it officially. What was the point? That there have been problems lately with fence lines getting cut, that some of the ranches in the valley have had calves go missing. He paused. That sometimes problems stop when people make cooperative decisions. Clara set the Winchester down. That's not subtle. No, he's done being subtle. Colton leaned against the doorframe, and she could see the fatigue in him that he didn't carry when things were going straightforwardly. A weight in the set of his shoulders that hadn't been there a month ago. I have to go to the county seat. Talk to the sheriff, get this documented properly. If Hendricks starts actually cutting fence or taking cattle, I need a paper trail. When? Tomorrow if I can. Day after at the latest. He looked at her. That puts you here short one hand. I know. I don't want you... He stopped, started again. I'd feel better if you had someone in the yard when I'm not here. I have 6 men in the yard, she said. I know, I mean... He stopped again and something moved across his face that he couldn't quite control, which was unusual for him. Harv Siddons doesn't frighten easily, and he's not gentle about how he operates. If he comes back and I'm not here... Mr. Mercer, she said. He looked at her. I was managing difficult men in ranch yards before I came here, she said. I appreciate that you're concerned, but I'm not going to fall apart because you're not on the property, and neither are your men. The expression on his face was complicated, something that wanted to be relieved and was having trouble getting all the way there. I know that, he said. That doesn't mean I have to like it. She considered this. It was, she thought, a more honest statement than he usually made. Go to the county seat, she said. I'll keep the gate watched. We'll be fine. He nodded, pushed off the doorframe, walked about 4 paces, and then, without turning back, said, The venison was, I meant to say, 3 weeks ago. The venison with the roasted onions. He paused. Best I've had. She watched him walk back toward the main house. You're welcome, she said, to the empty air, and went back to making supper. Colton left for the county seat on Wednesday morning. He was back by Friday, and he brought the sheriff's deputy with him on a return visit. A man named Haverford, humorless and thorough, who took down everything Colton told him with the careful handwriting of someone who understood that written records were the difference between being believed and not being believed later. Between Wednesday and Friday, the ranch did what it needed to do. Clara cooked. The hands worked. Abe walked the fence lines twice. Nothing happened, which was its own particular kind of tension, the before-something feeling that was worse in some ways than the something itself. On Thursday evening, Danny sat on the cookhouse steps while Clara cleaned up and talked, which he did when things were on his mind. You ever scared? He said. Generally, like as a condition. Sure, she said. Doesn't show. I told you already, showing it is a choice. Right. He was quiet for a moment, turning his hat in his hands. My brother runs a small farm in Idaho. My ma's still up there. I send them money when I can." He looked at the hat. "I keep thinking, if something happens to this job—" "Nothing's going to happen to this job," Clara said. "You don't know that." "No," she said honestly. "But Colton Mercer doesn't strike me as the kind of man who gives up something he built." Danny looked up at her. "You like him," he said, and his tone was curious rather than teasing, which made it harder to deflect. "I respect him," she said carefully. "That's not the same thing." "Isn't it?" "Not necessarily." She hung up the cloth with more precision than it required. "Go to sleep, Danny." He went, grinning at the ground. Clara stood at the cookhouse door for a while after he'd gone, watching the dark ranch yard, listening to the horses, the wind, the enormous indifferent Montana night. She thought about what Danny had said. She thought about Colton standing at the gate with the riders, and standing in the yard beside her, and not in front of her, and saying the best I've had to the empty yard rather than to her face, because it was easier that way for him. And she understood that because sometimes the honest things were easier to say to the air. She thought about a man who rinsed his own bowl and ran a good ranch and carried something heavy in the set of his shoulders and had eyes the color of storm clouds. She went inside before her thoughts could get more specific than that. "Mom, the ambush didn't come at the ranch. It came on the road back from Delwood, on a Saturday, 2 weeks after Harv Siddon's visit. Clara had gone to town again for supplies, Bob. The regular order was short on cornmeal, and she needed it before Monday. She'd been in and out of the general store in under an hour, had managed to avoid Margaret Calloway or anyone of that disposition, and was driving Ruth back along the main road in the early afternoon with the light good and the air still cold but not hostile. She was 2 miles out of town when the rider came up beside her from the tree line, just one. She registered that first, one rider, which was either confident or foolish. Young man, maybe 22, with a bandana pulled up below his eyes, which was theatrical rather than effective given the size of the valley and the number of people who would recognize the horse. "Stop the wagon," he said. Ruth kept walking. Clara didn't touch the reins. "I said stop the wagon," the man repeated, with the edged patience of someone who'd rehearsed this and was annoyed it wasn't going to script. "You're pointing that at a woman coming back from a grocery run," Clara said. He had a pistol out, which she'd noticed immediately. "Is that what you're doing with your Saturday? Just stop. I want the strongbox." "There's no strongbox. I have cornmeal and dried goods and $12.60 in household coin." He pulled his horse sideways, blocking the road. Ruth stopped on her own, because Ruth had good instincts about blocked roads. "Don't care what it is," he said. "Get down." Clara looked at him for a long moment. She looked at the pistol, the horse, the tree line, the road ahead and behind. She did this rapidly and without appearing to do it. Then she stood up on the wagon bench, which was not what he expected. Standing, she was a foot above him. The flour sack that held the Winchester was visible under the bench, which was also not hidden, had never been hidden, and which he was now looking at. "Son," she said, which she used deliberately, "that pistol's pointed at a woman on a supply run. The Winchester under this bench is not pointed at anyone yet, but I'm standing directly over it, and I have faster hands than you're accounting for." She held his eyes. "The $12.60 isn't worth what happens next. I promise you that." He stared at her. She could see his thinking, which was loud and not deep. "You're bluffing," he said. "Maybe," she said. "You want to find out?" A moment of absolute stillness, the kind that only happened when a situation was balanced at its narrowest point. Then the young man lowered the pistol, turned his horse, and rode back into the tree line at a pace that started as dignity and became something faster once the trees closed around him. Clara sat back down on the bench. Her hands were shaking, which was the body telling the truth about what the face had refused to show. She gripped the reins until the shaking stopped, which took about 30 seconds, then clicked her tongue at Ruth and kept going. She was 2 miles from the ranch when she passed Colton coming the other direction on horseback. He pulled up beside the wagon. He looked at her face. "What happened?" he said immediately. "Someone tried to rob the wagon on the road." His face went very still. "Are you—" "I'm fine. One man, young, didn't know what he was doing. He left." She met his eyes. "I'm fine, Colton." It was the first time she'd used his given name without the prefix. She'd said Mr. Mercer for weeks, said it like a habit, and then just now she'd said Colton, and it had come out of her mouth without negotiation, and there it was, in the air between them. He looked at her for a moment. Something in his face had changed, something that was sharper and more unguarded than she'd seen from him before, like the controlled surface had cracked in a specific place. "You're sure?" he said. "Yes. I'll ride back and look at the tree line. He's long gone. It wasn't professional." "Clara." He said it with a quality she hadn't heard in his voice before. Not command, not authority, just her name with weight behind it. "You're shaking." She looked down at her hands. "I told you I was a little scared," she said. He sat on his horse for a moment, looking at her with those storm cloud eyes and whatever was in them that she couldn't quite categorize. Then he turned and rode alongside the wagon the 2 miles back to the ranch, without saying anything else, just beside her, which was what she needed without knowing she needed it until it was there. The ranch hand saw them come in and read the situation correctly and said very little, which she appreciated. Danny brought her coffee without being asked. Abe looked at Ruth's hooves, which didn't need looking at, because he needed to do something useful. Clara drank the coffee at the cookhouse table and let the afternoon get quieter, and she didn't go back to cooking until she was ready, and nobody hurried her. Later, when the kitchen was going again and the supper smells were doing what they always did to the yard, she heard Colton's voice through the cookhouse window, talking to Abe near the barn. She couldn't hear the words, just the low, steady sound of it. She made cornbread and a thick potato soup and put extra seasoning in the soup because the day had earned it. That night the hands ate without their usual noise, subdued by the day's proximity to something that could have gone worse. Clara served them and watched them eat and felt, unexpectedly and with a sharpness that surprised her, that she did not want to leave this place. Not the cookhouse, not the kitchen, not the work, not the men she was cooking for, or the ranch they were keeping, or the enormous, brutal, beautiful land it sat on. And not the man who had ridden alongside her wagon in silence for 2 miles because that was what he could offer, and he'd offered it without being asked. She was in trouble, she thought, carrying the empty pot back to the stove. Not the gun on a road kind. The other kind. The kind that crept up on a practical woman who was paying attention to the wrong things while she was busy being practical. She cleaned the pot. She would deal with it the way she dealt with everything. Practically, with both eyes open, and without making it anyone else's problem until she knew what it actually was. Outside, the wind had picked up, carrying the smell of rain, and somewhere above the ranch, the enormous Montana sky was doing its nightly thing of being more sky than any reasonable person needed, full of stars that didn't care about any of this, which was oddly comforting. Clara dried her hands on the cloth, hung it on its nail, and went to bed. The rain that had been threatening all week finally arrived on a Monday night, and it arrived with everything it had. Clara woke at 2 a.m. to the sound of it hammering the cookhouse roof, not the sideways Montana rain she'd come to know, but something heavier, more vertical, the kind that came straight down with intention. She lay still for a moment, listening, and then she smelled it. Smoke. Not cookhouse smoke. Not the residual smell of her own stove, which she knew intimately by now. This was different, sharper, with something acrid underneath it, the smell of wood that was burning fast and wrong. She was out of the cot and at the door before she'd finished processing it. The barn. The far corner of the large barn was lit from inside, orange and climbing, visible even through the rain, which should have been slowing it and wasn't. The horses. That was her first coherent thought. Santos's horses, the working stock, 3 animals and stalls in that barn, and the fire was already into the roof timbers by the look of the glow. She hit the bunkhouse door with her fist hard enough to feel it in her knuckles. Fire. The barn. Get up. She didn't wait to hear them respond. She ran to the barn. The heat reached her 10 feet from the door. A wall of it, wrong and aggressive, the way fire felt when it had been going longer than it looked. She got the barn door open, and the smoke rolled out over her, and she went in anyway, low, the way you had to, because the air near the floor was the last good air. The horses were in the far stalls, all 3 of them already panicking, whites of their eyes showing, feet moving. Clara got to the first stall. Santos's gray, a horse named Cinco, who trusted her now after weeks of mourning grain, unlatched the stall, got her shoulder against the horse's neck, and pushed him toward the door. He went, bolting, because a frightened horse will run toward an opening if you get out of its way. The second horse was Pete and Will's shared roan, who was smarter than most and more frightened because of it. Clara got the stall open, and the horse spun, and she had to get behind him and slap his flank hard, once, to send him through the door. The third horse was Colton's bay. The bay was in the corner of his stall, which was the wrong instinct. Horses pressed corners when they panicked, which trapped them. The smoke was thicker now. Clara's eyes were streaming. She found the stall latch by feel, got it open, went in, grabbed the halter that was hanging on the post, got it on the horse's head in the dark by the same feel, and pulled. The bay didn't want to come. "Come on," she said, which was barely a sound through the smoke. She pulled again, her weight back, heels dug in, and the horse shifted, and she pulled again, and he came forward 1 step, 2 steps, and then something cracked above them. A timber, loud as a gunshot. And the horse lunged forward and took her with him, and they came out of the barn door together into the rain with the kind of gracelessness that meant they were both alive, which was sufficient. She let go of the halter. Santos caught the bay before he could bolt. He'd materialized out of the dark, which was what Santos did in a crisis. Appeared exactly where he needed to be, without fanfare. He took the horse's head and spoke to him quietly in Spanish, the particular low, rapid cadence that settled animals when nothing else did. Danny and Marcus and the twins were on the barn, working the pump, dragging the leather bucket line. Abe was directing them with the economy of a man who'd fought a barn fire before and remembered what mattered. Cutter had an axe and was doing something to the west wall that Clara couldn't parse until she understood he was cutting a fire break, pulling burning material away from the secondary structure, the tack room, which had expensive equipment in it and was sharing a wall with the worst of the fire. The rain was helping now. Not stopping it, but fighting it. Colton was at the pump. He was working it with his sleeves gone to the elbow, rain-soaked, his face lit orange and then dark by the rhythm of the fire. He saw her come out of the barn with the horse, and something crossed his face that she only saw for a second before it was replaced by the functional expression of a man who had a fire to fight. "Clara," he called. "I've got the horses out," she said. "All 3. He held her eyes for one moment. Just one, with the fire behind him and the rain coming down. And then he turned back to the pump. It took an hour. The barn didn't fall, but a third of it burned. The east wall was gone. 2 roof sections were open to the sky, and the structure would need significant work before it was reliable again. The tack room survived because of what Cutter had done with the axe, which saved them several $100s in equipment. The horses were all uninjured. When it was over, not over, but stable, the fire reduced to smoking wet ruin rather than active threat. They stood in the yard in the rain, and nobody said anything for a while, because there wasn't anything to say yet that wouldn't be wrong. Clara went inside and put water on to boil. She made coffee that was too strong and didn't apologize for it, and she made cornbread from the batter she'd had ready for morning, and she carried it all out to the bunkhouse table at 4 a.m, and the men sat down and ate it without speaking much, which was the right response to 4 a.m. after a fire. Colton came in last. He had a burn on his left forearm, not serious but real. An angry red stripe where something had caught him, probably a piece of falling timber. He sat at the table and Clara set a cup of coffee in front of him and then looked at his arm. "Let me see that," she said. "It's nothing." "I didn't ask if it was something. Let me see it." He turned his arm over. The burn was about 4 inches long, superficial, but in the category that needed cleaning and covering or it would get infected. Clara got the kit she kept in the cookhouse. Not elaborate, just clean cloth, the carbolic salve she'd bought in Delwood, and bandaging. And came back. She sat across from him and cleaned the burn. He didn't move or make a sound, which was either stoicism or stubbornness. She'd stopped trying to differentiate. "The fire was set," he said. "I know." She'd smelled the accelerant when she went in, something petroleum-based, under the smoke. You didn't use lamp oil to start a cook stove fire. Someone wanted the horses, or wanted to draw people outside. He watched her wrap the bandage. If that fire had gotten to the second barn, it didn't. "Because you woke up." She tied off the bandage. "Because I smelled it. Anyone could have. No one else did." She didn't respond to that. She put the kit away and sat back down with her own coffee, and they sat at the table while the men around them talked in low voices about the barn, about what timbers could be salvaged, about the fence line that Marcus had checked earlier in the week and found intact but wanted to check again in daylight. "It was Hendricks," Abe said. Not a question. Has to be, Colton said. Harv Siddons wouldn't do it himself, but he'd send someone. We've got nothing that proves it. Not yet. Colton's voice was flat in a way that was different from his usual flatness. The usual flatness was contained. This was the flatness of something that had been pushed far enough to compress. The room was quiet for a moment. I want someone awake at night, Colton said. Rotating. Nobody sleeps the full night until this is resolved. Nobody argued. The twins volunteered for the first 2 rotations, which was the kind of thing the twins did. They argued about everything small and agreed on everything that mattered. Clara got up and made more cornbread because she needed to be doing something with her hands, and because what she was thinking while she worked the batter was the thing she didn't say out loud yet. She'd been watching this pattern for weeks. Hendricks was escalating in a specific sequence: intimidation, then threat, then attempted robbery, and now fire. Each step more serious than the last, which meant the next step would be more serious than fire. She didn't know what that looked like out here, in practical terms. She had some guesses, and none of them were comfortable. The days after the fire had a different texture. The ranch still functioned, had to function, because cattle didn't understand emergencies and didn't reduce their needs in response to human difficulty. But there was a watchfulness layered over everything, the way a household got after something went wrong in the night. Everyone was a little more alert, a little less easy, sleeping less deeply than before. Clara found herself waking at 2 in the morning every night for a week, listening for smoke. She didn't find any, but she lay awake in the listening for it, which was its own kind of cost. She was standing in the yard on Friday morning when Colton appeared from the main house with his coat on and the expression of a man who'd made a decision and was feeling its weight. I found out something from Haverford, he said, meaning the deputy. Hendrick's land loan is past due. He borrowed against the consolidated purchase, and the lender's calling it. He has 6 weeks, maybe 8. So he's out of time, Claire said. He's desperate, which is worse than just aggressive. He looked at the burned barn wall. The remaining ranchers who haven't sold, there are 4 of us now, after the Harmons gave in last fall, have been talking about filing a joint complaint. There's a circuit judge coming through the county seat in 3 weeks. If we can document what's been happening across all 4 properties, we have a case. 3 weeks is a long time if he's got 6, she said. I know. She turned to look at him directly. What aren't you telling me? He looked back at her with those gray eyes that were harder to read than clouds, because clouds at least moved. Haverford said there's been talk in town, that one of the remaining holdout ranchers is going to get an example made of him, not just property damage. Clara held his gaze. Someone's going to get hurt. That's what the talk says. The morning air between them was very still. I want you to go to Delwood, he said. Stay with... No, she said. Clara, no. She said it without heat, but with the particular quality that meant it was done. I'm not going to Delwood while your barn is half burned and Harv Siddons is out there organizing something worse. I'm not leaving. His jaw worked. You're not my responsibility to protect if you won't. I'm not asking you to protect me. I know you're not. That's the problem. He said it with a frustration that was too unguarded for him, the kind that came out when something had been held in long enough to find the weak seam. You never ask for anything. You just stand there and handle it, and it makes it harder. She blinked. It was not what she'd expected him to say. Harder, she said carefully. He looked away, at the fence line, at the sky, at the barn wall, at anywhere that wasn't her. To not say things, he said, which was not an explanation exactly, but was something. The morning sat between them. Then say them, Clara said. He looked at her. The yard was empty. Hands out on the range, Santos in the small barn, the distant sound of Pete and Will arguing about something inconsequential, as they always were. Just the 2 of them in the early light, with the half-burned barn behind him and the enormous blue Montana sky above everything. I don't want you to go to Delwood because I want you here, he said. That's not the same as you being safe, and I know that, and I've been trying to decide which of those things mattered more to me. He paused. I haven't been able to decide, which is... He stopped. Started again. It's been a while since something was hard to decide. She looked at him for a long time, at the burn on his forearm that was healing under the bandage she'd put there, at the jaw that needed shaving again, at the gray eyes that were on her directly now, rather than anywhere else. "I'm staying," she said. "Not because you want me here, because I want to be here. That's my decision, and it's made." He absorbed this. "All right," he said. "But if you have something to say to me, Colton, say it when this is over, when there's room to say it properly." He looked at her with an expression that was finally fully readable, not because it was simple, but because he'd stopped managing it. "When it's over," he said. "Yes." She nodded once and went back to the cookhouse, because breakfast needed finishing, and because she needed 30 seconds alone with what had just happened, which she used to stand very still at the stove and breathe in and breathe out and feel the full weight of being a practical woman who had managed to fall for a difficult man in the middle of someone else's land war. Then she finished the biscuits. But the attack came on a Sunday. Not at night. That was the thing that surprised her about it. Broad daylight, mid-morning, the sky clear and cold and the kind of blue that looked painted. Clara was in the kitchen. 3 of the hands were in the far pasture. Colton and Abe were working on the burned barn section, trying to assess what timber could be reclaimed. Santos was in the small barn. Cutter was on the bunkhouse porch. Danny and Marcus were fixing the east fence. She heard the riders before she saw them. More than 3 this time. She counted hoofbeats and got to 6 before they came through the gate, and there were 7 total, which was not a friendly visit in any organizational structure she recognized. Harv Siddons was in the front. She recognized him from his first visit, the build, the way he sat his horse, the specific quality of a man who'd been told he could do this and was therefore relaxed about it. He had 6 men behind him, 2 of whom had rifles already out, which crossed a line that the previous visits hadn't crossed. Clara moved to the cookhouse door. Cutter was already off the bunkhouse porch and moving laterally, away from the main group of riders, which was smart. You didn't cluster in a situation like this. Santos appeared in the small barn doorway. Harv pulled up in the yard and looked around with the surveying expression of someone assessing a problem. "Mercer," he called. Colton came around the side of the main barn. He had a hammer in his hand. He looked at the 7 riders and the drawn rifles, and he didn't change his pace. "Siddons," he said. "Hendricks wants to make you one more offer," Harv said. "Last one. You've got 5 minutes to think about it." "I've had months to think about it." Colton stopped about 15 feet from the lead horse. He didn't look at the rifles. "The answer's still no. 5 minutes," Harv said, and his tone had shifted into something that no longer pretended to be a business conversation. Clara looked at the yard. Cutter had positioned himself behind the water trough, which provided cover. Santos was still in the barn doorway. Abe had appeared at the corner of the main barn. No sign of Danny or Marcus yet. They were too far out. The 2 men with rifles were watching Colton. They weren't watching her, which was a mistake. She picked up the Winchester. She did not go out the front of the cookhouse. She went out the back, circled around behind the structure, and came up the east side of the yard where there was a fence and a wagon that she used as cover, moving quietly because the rider's attention was on Colton and the sound of the confrontation. She got to the wagon and went still. From here she had an angle on the man on the far right with the rifle. Not a shot she wanted to take, not a shot she was planning to take, but an angle that changed the geometry of the yard in a meaningful way if anyone noticed her. "Last chance," Harv was saying. "You came here with 7 men and guns drawn," Colton said. "That's not a business offer. So tell me what this actually is." Harv's expression changed. The pretense dropped. "It's a transfer," he said. "You sign the papers Hendricks drew up today, here, right now, or we make sure there's not enough left to bother selling." Colton looked at him for a moment. "No," he said. It happened fast. Harv's hand moved toward his coat, and Abe, who had been a still point the entire confrontation, threw something, a piece of iron, scrap from the barn repair, that hit the railing post beside Harv's horse with a sharp crack, which spooked the horse sideways, which upset the rider on his left, which meant the rifle on that side went up instead of out. Cutter came up from behind the trough with his own rifle. Clara came around the front of the wagon with hers. Santos emerged from the barn with the shotgun he apparently kept in there, which was information she'd file away later. The yard geometry had changed. 7 riders, 4 guns from angles they hadn't accounted for. Harv Siddons did the math in about 2 seconds, which was faster than she'd expected from him, and held his hand out palm flat to his men. "Wait." The yard was completely silent, except for the horses. Colton hadn't moved. He still had the hammer. He stood in the same spot he'd been standing and looked at Harv Siddons with the flat gray eyes that she knew now better than she'd known anything about a person in a long time. "You came onto my property with drawn rifles," Colton said. "That's going to be documented and reported, and Haverford's name is on a letter that goes to the circuit judge on Monday, with or without an incident here today." He paused. "But if you want an incident, we've got 4 guns, and you've got 7 men who haven't looked behind them recently." Harv looked, slowly. Behind the riders, Danny and Marcus had come through the back gate, the one that opened from the east pasture, and they were on foot, and they were armed, and they'd apparently run most of the way from the fence line because they were breathing hard and their hats were off, and Marcus looked furious in the particular contained way that Marcus got furious, which was the most frightening kind. 9-7. And the 9 had better positioning. Harv Siddons worked his jaw for a moment. He looked at Colton. He looked at Clara, specifically, with the expression of a man recalculating something he'd dismissed. "This isn't done," he said. "I know," Colton said, "but today it is." Harv wheeled his horse and rode out. His 6 men followed, and they went with the chastened quality of men who'd ridden in expecting easy and found something else. The gate closed behind them. Nobody moved for a moment. Then Danny let out a sound that was something between a breath and a word, and Will said, "Lord Almighty," and immediately looked at Clara like he'd said something wrong, which made her want to laugh at the absolute wrong moment. Colton turned. He looked at Clara across the yard, the distance of maybe 30 feet between them, and she was standing beside the wagon with the Winchester in the cold morning air, and her pulse going at a rate that she was not going to admit to anyone. He crossed the yard. He stopped in front of her. He looked at her, at the rifle, at her hands, at her face, with an expression that was not controlled at all anymore, not even a little, all that careful management gone. And what was underneath was complicated and real and looking directly at her. "You came around the back," he said. "Their attention was forward," she said. "It changed the angles." "You could have—" He stopped. "If they'd seen you move, they didn't." "Clara." Her name in his voice with that weight again, the weight she'd been hearing grow for weeks. "I'm fine," she said. "We're all fine." He took the Winchester from her hands, not taking it away from her, just his hands over hers on the stock, and he held them there for a second, and she could feel that his hands were not entirely steady either, which was the most honest thing she'd seen from him. "When this is over," he said. "Yes," she said, "when it's over." He held her hands for one more second. Then he let go, stepped back, and turned to the yard with the practical expression returning, because there was work to do, and he was a man who did work when it needed doing. "Abe," he said, "I need that letter finished and on its way to Haverford today. Marcus, can you ride?" "Now?" Marcus said. "Now," Colton said. "I want Haverford out here to see that yard before the hoof prints go soft." The ranch reorganized itself into motion around her. Clara stood for a moment holding the space where his hands had been. Then she went inside and put coffee on, because it was the right thing to do and because she needed to do something that made sense while everything else was being what it was. She stood at the stove and listened to the yard through the window. Colton's voice, Abe's voice, the sound of Marcus's horse being brought around, Danny saying something that made Santos laugh quietly. The ordinary sounds of a ranch that had survived a Sunday morning and was already deciding what to do next. She poured a cup and held it in both hands. Outside, the Montana sky was enormous and unhurried above all of it, the same sky it had always been, not caring about Harv Siddons or Cal Hendricks or land loans or burned barns or the particular feeling in her chest that she had been practical about for weeks and was finding increasingly difficult to be practical about. She drank the coffee. Outside, Colton was giving instructions in his level voice, and she could pick it out from all the other sounds the way you could always pick out the one sound you'd learned to listen for, which told her everything she needed to know about where she was and what she was going to do about it when there was finally room to do it. She set down the cup and started making a second pot. The day was still going, and there was still work in it, and she had always known how to work. Marcus reached Haverford before noon. The deputy arrived at the ranch by mid-afternoon with a second man, a territorial marshal named Briggs, who had been at the county seat on other business, and who, when Haverford explained the situation, had decided his other business could wait. Briggs was a compact, unhurried man in his 40s with a neatly trimmed beard and the particular quality of someone who had spent a long career determining which situations were what they appeared to be and which were not. He walked the yard slowly. He looked at the hoof prints, the gait, the angles. He asked Colton to describe the positioning of the riders and the drawn rifles with the careful attention of a man building something in his head that he would need to be accurate later. He talked to Abe, then to Cutter, then to Santos, each separately, which was the right method because separate accounts that matched each other were worth more than a single group account. He talked to Clara last. She'd expected him to talk to her briefly, as an afterthought. In her experience, women's accounts in official situations were received with a kind of courtesy that didn't fully extend to being believed. But Briggs sat across the cookhouse table from her with his notebook and asked questions that were specific and followed from her previous answers. And when she described coming around the back of the cookhouse and the angle she'd taken behind the wagon, he nodded once and wrote it down without comment. "You've done something like that before," he said. It wasn't quite a question. "I've been in difficult situations before," she said. "Where?" "Colorado mostly, different circumstances." He looked at her for a moment with eyes that were professionally neutral and personally curious. "You work here as the cook." "That's right." "And you took a flanking position with a rifle during an armed confrontation on the property." "Someone needed to." He wrote something down. "Miss Ashford, in your assessment, and I'm asking because you were positioned to observe the entire yard, what was the intent of the men who came here today?" She thought about it honestly, because he deserved that. "They came to take something by force," she said. "The papers, the property, or enough damage to both that it amounted to the same thing. They weren't there to negotiate. The rifles were out before anyone said a word." Briggs nodded and closed his notebook. He spoke to Colton privately for about 20 minutes in the main house. Then he and Haverford rode out with the documentation they'd gathered, and Briggs said, before he left, that he'd be contacting the circuit judge and that Colton should expect to be called as a witness, and that in the meantime he was advising all parties to conduct themselves with restraint, which was the official way of saying what everyone already understood. When they were gone, the ranch was very quiet. The hands drifted toward the bunkhouse by degrees. Santos put the horses up. The afternoon light went long and golden over the burned barn section and the repaired fence and all the ordinary damage of the past weeks. Colton stood at the edge of the porch and looked at it. Clara came and stood beside him. Not in front of him, not behind him. Beside him. He didn't look at her. He kept looking at the yard. "Briggs thinks the case is solid enough to move on Hendricks directly. If the other holdout ranchers filed jointly—" "Colton," she said. He stopped. She turned to look at him. He was already looking at her. He'd been looking at her, she realized, for the last few seconds at least, and she'd caught him at it. "You said when it's over," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "It's not fully over." "No. But it's over enough." She held his eyes. "I've been practical about this for a long time, and I'm running out of practical." Something moved in his face. Not the flicker she'd cataloged in those first weeks. Not the controlled, almost expression. Something that just opened, the way a window opens in a room that's been closed too long. "I'm not good at this," he said. "Saying things. I know. I've been alone long enough that I don't always know what I have anymore, until it's right in front of me." He looked at her steadily, with an effort she could see and respected. "You came around the back of that building this morning, and I didn't breathe for 10 seconds. 15, she said. "I counted." He almost smiled. "You counted." "I was watching you." The almost smile became something more, something that reached his eyes and stayed there, and she thought it was probably the first genuine, unguarded smile she'd seen from him in 3 months, and it was worth the wait. "Clara Ashford," he said, "I would like very much for you to stay. Not as the cook, or as the cook. You're an extraordinary cook. I'm not dismissing that, but also as—" He stopped. Tried again. "I want to build something here that's worth building. I've been doing it alone and it works, but it's not what it could be. And I think what it could be has something to do with you." She looked at him for a long time, at the man who rinsed his own bowl and stood beside people and said the honest things to the empty air because it was easier than saying them directly, and who was saying them directly now, imperfectly, with the grammar of someone who hadn't done this in a long time. "Ask me plainly," she said. "You can do it." He took a breath. "Will you stay? As my partner? My wife, if you're willing. If that's too much, too fast." "It's fast," she said. "I know, but not too much." She held his gaze. "Yes, I'll stay." He reached out and took her hand, which was not a dramatic gesture, just a hand taking a hand in a ranch yard in the late afternoon, with the smell of the burned barn still in the air and the horses in the corral and the enormous Montana sky doing nothing in particular except being there. "Good," he said. She turned her hand over and held his. "I should tell you," she said, "that I'm not easy either." "I know," he said. "That's part of it." From somewhere in the bunkhouse, Danny's voice carried across the yard. He was telling a story to Pete and Will that apparently involved a lot of exaggerated volume, and the ordinary life of the ranch reasserted itself around them, which was right. Clara let go of his hand and went back to the cookhouse to start supper, because supper still needed making. And if she stood at the stove for a moment without doing anything, just stood there and felt the full weight of it, the yes she'd said and what it meant and the particular quality of a decision that was large enough to change the shape of your future, well, that was between her and the cookhouse and the Montana evening coming down outside the window. They married 6 weeks later in Delwood, with Haverford as a witness, and Abe standing in for family on Colton's side, and Danny, who cried, which he would deny and everyone would remember, standing on Clara's. It was not an elaborate ceremony. The justice of the peace was a practical man named Crowell, who got through the essentials in under 10 minutes, which suited both of them. Clara wore her good dress, which was dark blue, and had been packed in her trunk for 2 years waiting for an occasion that hadn't come until now. Colton wore a clean shirt and his good boots and looked like a man who was doing the most serious thing of his adult life and knew it. Afterward, they ate at the diner, pie and bad coffee, which was by then something of a private joke, and drove back to the ranch in the late afternoon. The hands had done something to the cookhouse while they were gone. Nothing large. A wreath of dried wildflowers on the door, the inside swept, and a small bunch of late-season wild asters in a tin cup on the table. Clara stood in the doorway and looked at it. "Danny's idea," Santos said from somewhere behind her. "Of course it was," she said, and her voice was steady, which was a thing she worked at. She moved into the main house that week. The cookhouse became what it had always been, a kitchen and workspace. And her cot went to the twins, who had been sharing one and complaining about it since before she arrived. Her trunk went into the main house bedroom, which had more space than she'd had in years and felt enormous for the first 3 nights. Colton was a different kind of presence in close quarters than she'd anticipated. Not difficult exactly, but specific in his habits in the way that people who'd lived alone long enough became specific, particular about where things went. A natural early riser who was confused by anyone who wasn't, prone to silence at odd moments that meant nothing except that he was thinking and didn't feel the need to fill space with words. She had her own specificities. She rearranged the kitchen shelves in the main house on the 4th day because they'd been organized wrong for years, and it was bothering her. He came in, looked at the reorganization, and said nothing, which she understood as acceptance. She learned to read his silences the way she'd learned to read the Montana sky. What kind of quiet it was, what it contained, whether it was going to develop into something. They argued twice in the first month. Once about money. She had opinions about how the ranch accounts were structured and said so, and he had the instinctive resistance of a man who'd been managing his own finances for 15 years, and they went around on it for the better part of an evening before arriving at a compromise that was better than either original position. Once about a ranch hand, a new hire named Gentry, who made Clara uneasy in a way she couldn't fully articulate, and Colton, who trusted his own assessment and hadn't shared hers. They disagreed. Gentry stayed. Gentry stole from the supply store 3 weeks later and was gone by the end of the day. Colton did not say anything specific about this. He did come to the kitchen that evening and help her dry dishes without being asked, which was the Colton Mercer equivalent of a full apology. "Your judgment on people is better than mine," he said, drying a pot. "Not always," she said. "Just on Gentry." I'll try to account for it, he said, and she let it be. What? The matter of Cal Hendricks resolved itself over the course of the following months, not all at once, but in stages that felt unsatisfying as they happened and only made sense when she looked back at them later. The circuit judge heard the joint complaint from the 4 holdout ranchers in November. The documentation that Briggs had built, combined with testimony from Colton, from Abe, from Santos, and from Clara, whose account Briggs had apparently valued enough to include directly, was sufficient to open a formal investigation into Hendricks Consolidated's operations. Harv Siddons, facing charges related to the armed confrontation at the Mercer Ranch and a separate incident at the Paley property 2 valleys over, made the decision that most men in his position made. He told the court what he knew in exchange for a reduced charge. What he knew was considerable. Cal Hendricks, it turned out, had been defrauding his investors for 2 years, representing parcel sizes and cattle numbers that didn't exist, using new acquisition loans to service old ones, building a structure that was always going to fail and that he'd been trying to outrun by consolidating fast enough to make the numbers real before anyone checked. The intimidation, the fires, the armed confrontations, these were the acts of a man who understood that the whole construction would collapse if he didn't force enough land transfers to make his books match his claims before his investors sent their own auditors. They sent auditors in December. Hendricks Consolidated was dissolved in the spring. Cal Hendricks himself was tried on fraud charges in the county seat and convicted, which Clara knew about from a letter Haverford sent because she'd asked him to keep her informed. The sentence was what it was, insufficient, probably, given what he'd put people through. But it was something, and the land he'd consolidated reverted in complicated legal ways to creditors and previous owners, which meant the valley map changed, and some of what had been lost was partially recovered. The Mercer Ranch received no direct restitution, which was not a surprise to Clara. Ranches that survived didn't get compensated for surviving. But the threat was gone, and the valley breathed differently without it, in the particular way that people who've been living under long pressure breathe when the pressure finally lifts, with a kind of bewildered relief, like they'd forgotten what regular air felt like. The barn got rebuilt in the spring, properly this time, with better timber and better planning. Clara organized the labor. She'd developed over the winter a facility for logistics that turned out to transfer cleanly from kitchen management to project management, which shouldn't have surprised her but did. She drew up the supply list, coordinated the delivery timing, managed the budget that Colton gave her with the directness of a man who'd realized that her instincts for that kind of thing were sharper than his. 3 ranchers from neighboring properties came to help with the raising. Their wives came too, which Clara hadn't fully anticipated, and the day turned into something that wasn't quite a party, but was adjacent to one, people working together toward a common thing, feeding each other, the ordinary social warmth of shared labor. Margaret Calloway did not come, but a woman named Ellen Paley, whose family ran one of the other holdout ranches, sought Clara out specifically that afternoon and said, without preamble, "I want to apologize for what was said about you in town." Early on. She was a direct woman, angular, with a handshake like a man's. "It wasn't right, and I should have said so at the time." Clara looked at her. "Who said it?" "Margaret. And others. I didn't say anything, which is nearly as bad." "It's different," Clara said, "but thank you for saying so now." Ellen Paley nodded briskly and went back to helping organize the lunch table. And that was that. Not a transformation of anything. Not a grand reconciliation, just one woman telling another woman the truth, which was its own modest and sufficient thing. By the end of the day, the barn frame was up. It wasn't finished. Finishing would take another week, but the frame stood in the late afternoon light, and everyone stood looking at it for a moment with the quiet satisfaction of people who'd built something real. Colton stood beside her, shoulder to shoulder. "Better than the old one," he said. "The foundation's better," she said. "The drainage will be better too, if Santos's recommendation holds." "It'll hold." She looked at the frame, at the people moving around the yard, the Paley family loading up to head home, Danny organizing the leftover lumber with the cheerful bossiness he'd developed since she'd started giving him actual responsibilities, Marcus talking quietly to Santos near the corral, Abe sitting on a fence post, watching everything the way Abe watched everything, with the settled attention of someone who decided long ago that watching was its own form of participation. "I've been thinking about the kitchen garden," she said. "In the spring," Colton said. "I know it's winter. I'm planning for spring." She'd been sketching it out in the evenings, a proper kitchen garden on the south side of the main house where the light was best. Tomatoes, which she'd been paying too much for in dried form. Fresh herbs, root vegetables. Enough of a yield that she could put things up for winter and reduce the supply costs. "I know you're planning," he said. "I've seen the sketches." The south fence would need to move about 4 feet. "I know. I looked at it." He paused. "It's possible." She turned to look at him. "You looked at it. You left the sketches on the kitchen table. I wasn't hiding them. I know." He glanced at her sideways, with the expression she'd come to know as the one that meant he'd been thinking about something longer than he was going to admit. "It's a good plan. The south side gets enough sun." She looked back at the barn frame. "I was also thinking about the supply arrangement. If we grew enough surplus, tomatoes especially, there's a market in Delwood that pays better than what we've been paying the supply wagon. It wouldn't be large, but it would be something." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "Abe mentioned something similar last year. I didn't do anything about it." "Why not?" He thought about it honestly. "I was managing the ranch to survive," he said. "Not to grow. There's a difference in how you think." She understood that. She'd seen it in him when she'd arrived. The ranch was functional, well run in the basic ways, but running on minimum investment because minimum investment was what a man alone, managing everything, could sustain. Survival mode. It was a hard thing to come out of even when the circumstances changed, because the habit of it got into the thinking. "Well," she said, "we can think differently now." He turned to look at her then, with that expression that still caught her sometimes. The one that was fully open, no management, no careful distance. The one she'd been the first person to see regularly and the only person who knew how to read. "Yes," he said, "we can." The dinner that evening was the largest the ranch had hosted since before Clara arrived. The Paleys stayed, and 2 of the hands from a neighboring property whose owners had come for the raising, and Danny invited a girl from Delwood named Rose, who was clearly terrified and clearly smitten, and whom Clara treated with such deliberate ordinary warmth that the terror receded within the first hour. The cookhouse table wasn't big enough, so they moved it outside despite the cold. Lanterns hung on the fence. Food passed back and forth, conversations overlapping. Clara served and ate and watched and felt, with a clarity that surprised her in its sharpness, that this was what the table had always been for. Not just the feeding, she'd always known how to do the feeding, but this. The table is the center of something, the place where people came in from their separate difficult days and became, for an hour, a collective thing. She'd been building it for months without fully recognizing that was what she was building, adding warmth and reliability and a reason to come in from the cold, until the warmth had accumulated enough to hold other people too. After everyone had gone and the yard was quiet and the hands had drifted to the bunkhouse, Clara sat at the kitchen table in the main house with the account ledger and the planning sketches and a cup of tea that had gone cold. Colton came in from seeing the Paleys off and sat across from her. He looked at her face. "What?" she said, because he had the expression of someone about to say something he'd been working up to. "Nothing bad," he said. "I was just thinking." "About? About what this is?" He gestured vaguely at the room, and by extension everything beyond it. "What we're building. I spent a long time thinking the point was to hold on to what I had, to not lose it." He looked at the table. "Tonight was something different." "Yes," she said, "you did that." She shook her head. "We did that. I cooked and organized it. You built the thing worth coming to." "We built it," he said. She looked at him across the table in the lamplight, her imperfect, difficult man who was figuring out slowly that survival wasn't the ceiling, and she thought about all the road she'd come down to get here, the rooms she'd slept in, the meals she'd made for people she'd left, the years of moving towards something she hadn't had a name for. "Yes," she said, "we built it." Outside, the Montana night was enormous and cold and full of stars, and the burned section of the old barn was replaced now by the frame of a better one. And in the morning, there would be work to do and plans to develop and a kitchen garden to lay out and accounts to balance and a ranch to run that was not just surviving anymore, but actually growing. But right now it was just lamplight and cold tea, and the quiet that wasn't empty. The kind that came from being in a room with someone you didn't need to fill space for. Clara closed the ledger. "Come to bed," she said. He reached over and turned down the lamp. The kitchen garden went in that April, exactly where Clara had sketched it. Moving the south fence took Colton and Santos 2 days and cost a bruised knuckle on Santos's part and a sustained argument between Pete and Will about the correct angle of the post holes that resolved itself the way their arguments always did. Loudly, inconclusively, and with the posts ending up correctly placed regardless. Clara planted in rows she'd measured twice, the way her mother had taught her, because seeds didn't care about your intentions, only about whether you'd done the preparation correctly. By July, the tomatoes were coming in faster than she could process them, which was the problem she'd wanted to have, and which she solved by enlisting Danny, who turned out to have a surprisingly careful hand for the work, and who spent 3 evenings that week at the kitchen table helping her put up jars while telling her in exhaustive detail about Rose from Delwood. "She said she'd think about it," Danny said, sealing a jar with the focused expression of a man trying to appear casual. "Think about what?" Claire said, though she knew. "I asked her to... I was thinking we might... I haven't exactly..." He exhaled. "I asked her to marry me." Clara set down her jar. "Danny? I know, it's fast. How long have you been seeing her?" 7 months. "That's not fast," she said. "What did you actually say to her?" He winced. "I may have said it while we were talking about something else. She was telling me about her sister's new baby. And I said, 'That's nice. I was thinking we could get married.'" Clara looked at him for a long moment. "You didn't." "I know," he said miserably. "Go back," she said. "Say it properly. Look at her when you say it. Make it the only thing happening in that moment. What if she says no? Then she says no, and you know, which is better than not knowing." She picked up her jar. "But she's not going to say no, Danny. She came to the barn raising in January when it was 15 degrees. That's not something a woman does for a man she's undecided about." He looked at her with the expression of someone receiving information that reorganized everything. "You think?" "I know," Clara said. "Ask her again. Do it right." He did. Rose said yes inside of 48 hours, which Danny reported with a kind of stunned joy that made the entire bunkhouse briefly celebratory and caused Will to shake his hand so many times that Pete had to make him stop. The wedding was in October. Clara made the food. Years had a way of accumulating on a working ranch before you noticed them. The kitchen garden became over time a source of genuine income, modest but consistent. Clara expanded it in the 3rd year, added a small greenhouse structure against the south side of the main house that extended the growing season by 6 weeks, and developed a supply arrangement with 2 restaurants in Delwood that paid better than the feed store market had. It was not a large operation. It was an additional thing, a layer of stability on top of the cattle work, and it was entirely hers, which mattered to her in a way she didn't need to explain to anyone. Colton learned to leave the kitchen accounts to her completely, which had taken longer to arrive at than the decision itself. He'd hover sometimes, early on, looking at the ledger with the expression of a man who was trying not to say something, and she'd look at him until he said it, and they'd discuss it, and usually her figures held. When they didn't, she said so and adjusted. Accuracy mattered more to her than being right, which was a distinction she'd tried to explain to him once, and which he'd eventually just absorbed by observation. Their first child, a girl, was born in the 2nd year of their marriage. They named her Ruth, after the horse that had carried Clara into this valley, and whose soundness and patience Clara had always considered a virtue worth honoring in a name. Ruth Mercer arrived in February, in the middle of a Montana winter, with a ferocity that the doctor described as unusual and that Clara privately thought made complete sense. She was not an easy infant. She cried at volumes that seemed disproportionate to her size and had opinions about everything from the temperature of her blankets to the time of her feeding that she communicated with exhausting clarity. Colton, who had no experience with infants and approached the first weeks with the careful bewilderment of a man who'd been given a responsibility he couldn't read a manual for, was the one who figured out that Ruth would settle if you walked her in slow circles rather than rocking her, which he did for hours in the night without being asked and without complaining. Clara watched him do this sometimes from the doorway, The big man in the lamplight, walking slow circles with the fierce small girl against his chest, the Montana night outside the window, the ranch quiet around them. She didn't say anything. There were things that were sufficient in themselves without being commented on. Their second child, a boy, came 3 years later. They named him Abe, because by that point the real Abe had been on the ranch for 22 years and had recently mentioned, in the offhand way he mentioned everything, that he supposed he'd stay until the ground got him, which was the closest he came to saying he'd found the place he intended to end at. Clara had told Colton that if the child was a boy, she wanted the name, and Colton had agreed without discussion, which was its own kind of eloquence. Young Abe was different from his sister in every way available. Easy, slow to anger, with a quality of patient attention that he'd apparently arrived with rather than learned. Santos, who had by that point been on the ranch for over a decade, and whose standing had evolved from ranch hand to something closer to a partner in the horse operation he and Colton had developed together, took a particular interest in the boy. By the time young Abe was 4, he was following Santos around the barn with the devoted focus of someone who has found the thing he is for. Ruth, meanwhile, was learning to read from Clara and to fix fence from Colton and to argue from apparently no one and everyone simultaneously. "She's difficult," Colton said one evening, in the tone of a man stating a fact without complaint. "Yes," Clara said. "She gets it from—" "Don't," Clara said pleasantly. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "She told Danny today that his assessment of the east pasture was incorrect and explained why. Was she right?" A pause. "Mostly." "Good," Clara said, and turned the page of the supply ledger she was reviewing. Danny and Rose moved off the ranch in the 4th year. Not far, just to a property outside Delwood that Danny had been slowly making arrangements for, a small cattle operation of his own. He came to tell Clara privately, before he told Colton, which she understood was his way of saying what she meant to him without saying it directly. "I wouldn't have asked her right the second time if you hadn't told me to," he said. He was sitting at the kitchen table, which he'd been doing since before she could remember not having him do it. "You'd have gotten there," she said. "Maybe." He looked at his coffee. "I want you to know that the years here were— coming here was the best thing I did." He stopped. "You were part of that. You are part of that." "Danny," she said. "I know. I'm going to stop." "Don't stop. I'm glad you said it." She looked at him, at the young man who'd told her being scared didn't show, and asked her where she learned to shoot and cried at her wedding and helped her put up tomato jars and was now going to be a rancher himself. "You're going to be fine out there." "You think?" "I've thought so for years." He left 3 weeks later. Rose cried, which was expected. Clara didn't, which was a choice, and which cost her something, which she paid. The ranch adjusted, as ranches did. New hands came, some stayed, some didn't. The ones who stayed became part of the particular culture that the Mercer Ranch had developed over the years. The expectation of decent treatment, the table that fed people well, the unspoken understanding that this was a place where the work was real and the people who did it were respected for it. New hands figured it out quickly, usually within the first week, because it was in this way the established hands moved through their work and in the way Colton talked to people and in the way Clara set the table. Marcus stayed for 11 years before going back to his family in Missouri, who needed him. He shook Clara's hand when he left, which was the only time he'd initiated physical contact in all the years she'd known him, and said, "Thank you for the cooking," which was the most Marcus had ever said about anything personal, and which she understood perfectly. Cutter stayed until the end. He never explained the scar, and no one ever asked. The railroad came to Delwood in 1891, which changed things the way railroads change things, suddenly and permanently, and not all of it well. The cattle market shifted. What had been a sufficient herd for the valley became, practically speaking, a small herd, because the market comparison points moved. Colton saw it coming 2 years before it arrived and started adapting early, which Clara had pushed for and which he'd agreed with after a few days of sitting with it. They diversified. More horses. Santos's operation grew into a genuine enterprise, breeding working stock that had a reputation across 3 counties for quality. The kitchen garden surplus became, in a modest way, a small preserved goods business that Clara ran with Rose's help after Danny established himself nearby. They weren't large scale. They were never large scale, but they were stable. And the stability came from having more than one thing, which was the lesson the Hendricks collapse had taught the valley. A man who'd built wide and thin had fallen, and the ones who'd built narrow and deep had held. The Mercer Ranch held. Ruth was 16 when she told her parents she intended to study medicine. She said it at the supper table without preamble, with the directness that had been her primary characteristic since she'd learned to form sentences. She laid out her reasoning. The nearest doctor was 14 miles away. The valley had lost 2 children the previous winter to illness that came on fast. She'd been reading the medical texts that Colton had ordered for her because she'd asked for them 3 years ago, and she understood them, and she intended to go east for training and then come back. Colton looked at Clara. Clara looked at Ruth. "What school?" she said. Ruth named one in Philadelphia. She'd already written to them. "You wrote to them," Clara said. "They responded." "I have the letter." Colton set down his fork. He looked at his daughter, at the 16-year-old girl who had his eyes and her mother's jaw, and an argument structure that neither of them had taught her, and both of them recognized. "Show me the letter," he said. She produced it from her apron pocket, which meant she'd been carrying it to the dinner table for this exact moment, which meant she'd planned the entire conversation, which meant she was her mother's daughter in the specific way that could not be explained by anything except being in the same house with Clara Ashford Mercer for 16 years. Clara read the letter. It was a serious institution. Their program was serious. The costs were significant. She set the letter down and looked at Colton. He looked at her. They'd had 1,000 conversations like this over the years, the ones conducted in a look, in the space between 2 people who knew each other well enough that language was sometimes redundant. What passed between them in those few seconds was not simple, because it wasn't a simple thing. It was the cost, and the distance, and the years she'd be gone, and the fact that the valley needed doctors, and the fact that their daughter had written to a medical school in Philadelphia and been carrying the response in her apron pocket, and the fact that both of them, in their separate ways, had been people who'd needed to go somewhere to become who they were. "All right," Colton said. Ruth looked at him, at her mother. Her expression, which had been braced for a fight, reorganized into something she didn't show very often, which was the look of someone who's been met rather than opposed. "That's it," she said. "Your father and I will talk about the costs," Clara said. "And you'll write back to them properly and get the specific enrollment requirements. And you'll talk to Doc Halsey in Delwood before you go, because he trained back east and he'll know things you need to know before you're in those rooms." Ruth sat with this. "That's actually practical advice." "I'm a practical woman," Clara said, and picked up her fork. Young Abe, who had been quietly eating through this entire exchange, said, "Can I have her room?" "No," said Ruth. "She'll be in Philadelphia." "I'll be back." "You can't have the room." "That's not logical." "It's my room." Clara and Colton looked at each other across the table, and what was in that look was not simple either. The exasperation of parents, yes, but underneath it something warmer, the recognition of 2 people who had built this particular chaos together and would not have subtracted any of it. Ruth came back, as she'd said she would. She came back with a degree and a colleague, a young doctor named Farrow, from Ohio, who had followed her west because she'd told him about the valley and he'd believed her, and whom she married the following year in a ceremony that Clara cooked for and Colton managed to get through without visible emotion until approximately the last 10 minutes. They set up a practice in Delwood together. Within 2 years, they were serving 4 valleys. Young Abe took over the horse operation when Santos retired, which Santos did at 63 with the same unhurried quality he'd brought to everything else in his life. He stayed on the property. Colton had offered him the small house near the east fence years ago, and Santos had accepted it in the spirit it was offered, which was not charity, but belonging. He spent his retirement doing exactly what he'd always done, minus the parts that were hardest on his knees, and continued to offer opinions about the horses with an authority that Abe received with the deference it deserved. Clara was 58 years old the autumn she sat on the porch of the main house in the late afternoon and understood, with the particular clarity that came from age rather than intelligence, what the last 27 years had actually been. Colton was beside her. He'd been beside her in this specific sense, present, close, sharing the same view. for so long that she sometimes had trouble remembering the texture of before. The rooms she'd slept in alone in the years before this ranch, this yard, this man. The memory was there, but it felt like reading about someone else's life, which was not a sad thing. It was just what time did to you if you were fortunate enough to have it. The ranch was quieter than it had been. Young Abe ran the horse operation with Santos's former precision and his own developing instincts. The cattle herd was managed well. The kitchen garden, expanded twice over the decades, maintained now with help from Abe's wife, a capable woman from Helena named Grace, who had taken to the preserved goods operation with genuine enthusiasm, still produced more tomatoes than anyone could reasonably want, and which Clara still put up in jars every summer because she'd been doing it for 25 years, and the rhythm of it was part of her rhythm now. Delwood had grown. The railroad had done that, along with the families who'd stayed after Hendrick's operation collapsed, and the valley returned to the scale of people rather than the scale of consolidated investment. Ruth and Pharaoh's practice had a small building now, properly constructed, with a waiting room. Danny's property had expanded twice, and he'd been elected to the county land board the previous spring, which he'd told Clara about with the same stunned quality he'd had when Rose said yes, like he still couldn't entirely believe the life that had accumulated around him. The world was changing. It changed constantly, and sometimes fast, and not all of it made sense to Clara, who had arrived in this valley on a wagon with a flour sack rifle and a practical disposition, and had watched the frontier become something else over the decades, less wild, more crowded, easier in some ways, and stranger in others. But the ranch was still the ranch. That was the thing she kept returning to, sitting on the porch in the autumn light with Colton beside her, and the enormous Montana sky doing what it had always done, being there, being enormous, being completely indifferent to everything below it, which was somehow still a comfort after all these years. Danny said the East County Road is going to be paved, Colton said. I know, he told me. Paved road out here. The world keeps going, she said. He was quiet for a moment. He had more gray in his hair now than dark, and the lines in his face were deep and honest, and she knew every one of them by origin. The ones that came from weather, from the years of outdoor work, from the 2 hard winters that had taken cattle and money and left them both exhausted and short with each other in ways they'd had to work back from. The lines at the corners of his eyes that were partly from squinting into Montana sun and partly from 27 years of having things worth smiling at. You ever regret it? He said. Not anxious about the answer, just asking, the way you could ask things after long enough. She considered it honestly because he'd asked it directly, and he deserved that. She thought about the roads she'd driven alone, the rooms she'd slept in, the tables she'd cooked for and then left. She thought about a rattlesnake on a road and a woman who shot it and kept going, and a ranch yard and a man in a doorway with a plate in his hand. She thought about standing in a kitchen at 4 a.m. after a fire, making coffee for men who were frightened and needed something warm, and a hand over her hands on a rifle in a yard, and the weight of a name, Colton, coming out of her mouth without permission and landing in the air between them like it had always belonged there. She thought about a girl named Ruth, who'd carried a letter in her apron pocket, and a boy named Abe, who followed horses the way water followed ground, and a table that had fed everyone who came to it for 27 years. No, she said. He nodded. You? She said. He turned to look at her. The gray eyes that she'd once compared to clouds before a storm, and that she now knew contained more weather than that, more warmth, more complexity, more of the specific man that she had spent her adult life learning the way you learned a language, until it was no longer translation, but thinking. The rattlesnake on the road, he said. I've thought about it sometimes. You shot it and kept going. It was in the way, she said. That's what I mean. He looked back at the yard, at the rebuilt barn that was better than the old one, at the south garden where the last of the season's tomatoes were finished and the beds were put to rest for winter. You just kept going, whatever was in the road. So did you, she said. That's not nothing. No, he said. It's not. The afternoon light was doing its autumn thing over the valley, long and gold and slightly melancholy in the way that October light was always slightly melancholy. Not because anything was wrong, but because light like that made you feel the passage of things, the movement of time, the fact that days were finite and that this one would end. But that was the thing Clara had learned in all the years of moving and working and building and staying. The finitude of days was not an argument against them. It was the whole point of them. A day that ended had happened. A year that passed had existed. A life built in an imperfect place with an imperfect man producing imperfect results that still fed people and sheltered people and raised people who went out and did useful things. That was not a small life because it wasn't a grand one. She had not saved the frontier. She had cooked for 8 men and stood her ground in a yard and said yes across a kitchen table and put up 27 years' worth of tomatoes and raised a doctor and loved a difficult man until he learned to be less difficult and occasionally slid back and had to be reminded, and she had stayed when staying was the harder choice, which it often was. That was the thing nobody told you about courage, that most of it wasn't the Winchester in the yard or the fire in the barn. Most of it was the daily decision to remain, to stay at the table, to finish the work even when you were tired, to say the true thing when the easy thing was available, to choose again and again the life you were actually in rather than some imagined life where nothing was this hard. She had done that. Not perfectly. She'd had days when she was short-tempered and unreasonable and wrong about things that mattered, and days when she doubted the choice, and days when the loneliness of having moved so much before arriving had surfaced unexpectedly, and she'd had to sit with it. She'd made decisions she'd regretted and said things she'd had to take back and failed at patience when patience was what was needed. But she'd stayed. And the staying had built something that would still be here after her, which was more than she'd had a right to expect when she'd stopped a wagon on a Montana road for a rattlesnake and kept going. "Getting cold," Colton said. "Yes," she said. Neither of them moved. The sky above the valley was turning, the blue going deeper toward the east, the west still holding its light for a few more minutes, the way the west always held light, longer than seemed fair. A hawk was working the air above the far pasture. She could see it from here, the easy tilted circles of something that was exactly what it was supposed to be, doing exactly what it was built to do, without any apparent difficulty about it. "Come inside," Colton said after a while. She stood up. Her knees were not what they'd been at 31, which was a fact she'd made her peace with, mostly. He stood too, and he held out his hand the way he'd been holding out his hand for 27 years. The simple, unremarkable gesture of a man who wanted to walk inside with his wife. And she took it the way she'd been taking it for 27 years, because some things you didn't stop doing just because they'd become ordinary, because the ordinary was what the extraordinary turned into if you were lucky enough and stubborn enough and willing enough to stay. They went inside. The door closed behind them. Outside, the Montana sky finished its business with the day in the particular unhurried way it always had, going dark from the east first, and then all at once. The stars arriving in their thousands, and then their millions. The same stars that had been there the first night Clara slept in the cookhouse at 31 years old and felt accurately sized by the universe. The stars didn't know what they'd witnessed. They were just stars. But the ranch was still there, and the light was on inside, and whatever had been built in that valley over all those years. The relationships, the meals, the children, the work, the ordinary days accumulated into something larger than any of them had planned. That was still there too, solid and unassuming and permanent in the way that truly built things were permanent. Not because they lasted forever, because they had mattered while they stood.